Imagine yourself walking through the foggy streets of old London, gas lamps flickering softly in the silent dawn, your breath curling in the cold morning air as footsteps echo down empty alleys. Tonight I invite you to leave behind your worries and drift into a calm, mysterious journey as we follow Sherlock Holmes into the hidden shadows beneath Whitechapel. A place where secrets sleep in damp stone cellars, where legends are reborn in hushed whispers, and where even the darkest mysteries unfold gently, allowing your mind to quiet as you listen. Settle into your bed, feel your body grow heavy and still, and let this slow, captivating story carry you into a peaceful night's rest. This is a tale of mystery, devotion, and hidden hope, told only for you, here, in the quiet hours before sleep. It was just past dawn when Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street, the sky still trapped beneath a blanket of thick gray clouds. The morning fog of London lay heavy over the city, pressing against windows and creeping through alleyways so dense it blurred gas lamps into small, glowing orbs floating in the mist. The smell of damp stone and cold iron filled the streets, mixed with faint traces of horse manure from the early carriages rattling along the cobblestones. Lestrade stepped out of the hansom cab and paid the driver with a shaking hand. He pulled his overcoat tighter around his chest. The wool was already soaked through, small droplets sliding down the dark fabric, dripping onto his polished leather shoes. He hurried up the stone steps of Baker Street, his boots echoing dully in the quiet dawn, and knocked twice before stepping inside without waiting for Mrs. Hudson to answer. Holmes was awake, as he always was before the city fully stirred. He sat near the window in his worn, high-backed chair, half hidden by the thick curtains. On the small wooden table by his side rested a delicate white porcelain cup with a blue rim filled almost to the edge with dark black coffee. The aroma drifted through the room, mingling with the lingering scent of stale pipe smoke and old books stacked in uneven towers against the walls. Holmes's eyes were closed, his long fingers draped over the curved arms of the chair. His breathing was deep and calm, as if he were meditating rather than simply resting before the day's work began. He wore a simple linen shirt, open at the collar, and dark gray trousers, his suspenders folded neatly over his shoulders. Near his feet sat his black shoes, perfectly polished the night before, waiting for purpose. Lestrade stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to the gentle ticking of the mantel clock above the dying embers of the fireplace. The inspector's breath trembled slightly as he exhaled, sending small clouds of condensation into the cold air of the room. He removed his hat, his thinning hair damp with fog, and cleared his throat softly. Holmes opened his eyes, revealing an expression calm yet focused. He leaned forward and reached for his cup, raising it to his lips without breaking eye contact with Lestrade. The faint clink of the cup returning to its saucer was the only sound before Holmes spoke. "What is it, Lestrade?" The inspector took 2 steps into the room, his shoes leaving small wet prints on the faded carpet. He glanced at Holmes, then at the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a restless spirit. "You must come with me immediately, Holmes. There has been another murder in Whitechapel." Holmes blinked slowly, absorbing the words with no change in his expression. He placed his hands together, fingertips pressed lightly, elbows resting on the chair arms. He looked into the steam rising from his coffee, silent for a long moment. Outside, the city remained hushed, as if listening with them. "Another murder, Lestrade. Jack has been gone for years." Lestrade nodded quickly, his eyes darkened by dread. He looked older in the morning light, deep lines carved around his mouth and forehead, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. That is what worries me. If it is him, or if it is someone acting in his name, London will not survive that terror again." Holmes exhaled softly, setting his cup aside. He stood, the wooden chair creaking faintly under his weight. He stretched his back with deliberate slowness, the linen shirt pulling gently over his lean frame. Then he reached for his simple black waistcoat hanging over the edge of the couch, slipping it on before buttoning each clasp with silent precision. He moved to his small writing table and opened the top drawer, removing his silver pocket watch. Flicking it open, he studied the delicate clockwork face for a moment before snapping it shut and slipping it into his waistcoat pocket. Then he turned to the window, pulling the curtain aside with 2 fingers. Beyond the glass, the world was a dim canvas of swirling gray and faint orange glow, where the gas lamps flickered in the distance. "The fog feels heavier today," he said softly, almost to himself. Then he turned to Lestrade with eyes sharpened by purpose. "Very well. Let us go and see what darkness has awakened so early this morning." Lestrade released a small breath of relief. Holmes picked up his simple felt hat from its hook near the door and reached for his dark gray coat, lifting it from the stand with a quiet swish of wool brushing wood. He pulled it on with a fluid motion, his movements practiced and silent. For a brief moment before leaving, Holmes glanced at the empty armchair across from his own, where Watson usually sat reading newspapers or polishing his medical bag. Watson was away visiting a patient in Surrey and would not return until nightfall. A flicker of unease crossed Holmes's gaze, quickly replaced by calm resolve. He nodded once at Lestrade, and together they stepped out into the silent morning, descending the stone steps into the heavy fog that curled around their legs like cold smoke. Their footsteps faded quickly behind them, swallowed by London's endless mist. As they walked toward the waiting cab, the city around them remained quiet, unaware that somewhere beyond the sleeping streets, in a narrow, blood-stained alleyway of Whitechapel, a shadow from the past had returned to write its story again, in blood. The cab rattled and swayed as it carried Holmes and Lestrade through the silent, fog-bound streets of London. Each turn of the wheels sent small vibrations through the wooden floorboards beneath their polished shoes. Outside the thin glass windows, only the faint glow of scattered gas lamps broke the gray monotony. London seemed almost deserted in those early hours, as if the city itself refused to wake to what awaited them in Whitechapel. When they finally arrived, the fog was beginning to thin near Dorset Street, revealing clusters of narrow brick buildings stained with soot and moisture. The road was lined with muddy puddles that reflected the pale gaslight, creating trembling pools of dim orange in the gloom. Thin alley cats slunk among piles of rubbish, their eyes bright and watchful. The murder scene lay just off Dorset Street, in a crooked alleyway no wider than a man's outstretched arms. Policemen in dark navy coats stood guard at both ends, their lanterns casting flickering beams across the bricks, exposing deep cracks filled with moss and grime. The quiet murmurs of officers filled the space with a low, uneasy hum, mixing with the distant clang of a milkman's cart somewhere beyond the alley entrance. Holmes stepped down from the cab without a word. As his feet touched the slick cobblestones, the cold rose through his leather soles, grounding him instantly in the grim reality ahead. Lestrade followed, his shoulders stiff under his damp overcoat, the collar turned high against the cutting morning air. They walked toward the alley, each step echoing off the tight walls. The smell grew stronger with every pace. Stale urine, rotting vegetables from nearby bins, the sharp metallic tang of blood that no fog could mask. A constable with a thin, downturned mouth raised his lantern higher as they approached. His eyes were wide and unfocused, as if he were seeing the scene over and over in his mind, unable to look away. He nodded stiffly to Lestrade and stepped aside, allowing them entry. Holmes paused at the entrance, his gaze sweeping the narrow corridor of bricks. He noticed everything in a single, silent scan. The scuffed footprints, the dragged smear of blood, the position of the lanterns casting long shadows against soot-stained walls. Only then did he allow his eyes to settle on the body. She lay half-turned on her side, close to a brick wall, blackened by decades of coal smoke. Her hair was dark, tangled with dirt and damp straw, strands clinging to the torn fabric of her thin shawl. Her throat had been cut clean through from left to right, the wound precise and smooth, revealing the pale gleam of cartilage and the deep darkness within. Her abdomen was opened from sternum to navel with the same eerie accuracy, exposing what no living eye should see. Holmes crouched low, careful not to disturb the sticky mud pooled beneath her hip. His coat brushed the edge of a small puddle, but he paid it no mind. The air was cold against his face, tinged with the faint scent of coppery blood and the heavier smell of human waste. Lestrade stood a few steps back, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on Holmes for guidance. The inspector's hands curled into fists inside his coat pockets, his knuckles whitening as the chill bit through wet wool. Holmes tilted his head slightly as he examined the throat wound. The edges were crisp, not torn or ragged, and the angle was shallow, suggesting the killer had stood slightly behind and to the left. He shifted his gaze to the abdominal incision, observing the exposed organs with detached precision. The cuts were deliberate, with no exploratory marks or hesitation. The killer had known exactly where to slice, as if following instructions memorized long before dawn ever came. Lestrade spoke softly, his voice nearly lost in the restless whispers of policemen down the alley. Same technique as the original Ripper murders. Holmes remained silent. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a slender magnifying glass with a polished wooden handle. Holding it over the wound, he examined the lines, the faint bruising along the skin, the direction of pressure. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, perhaps for an imitator. He shifted his weight, studying the mud near the woman's boots. Small stones pressed into the earth around her feet formed distinct patterns, suggesting someone had knelt near her body. Holmes traced them with his eyes, storing the impressions in his mind. There were no footprints leading away, only confused scuffs made by arriving officers. A quiet breeze drifted through the alley, stirring the hem of her skirt and carrying with it the mingled sense of decay, damp brick, and early morning coal fires burning in nearby homes. A clock tower struck the hour somewhere beyond the fog, its chimes muffled and heavy. Holmes stood slowly, careful to brush off the moisture that had gathered on the knees of his trousers. He returned the magnifying glass to his pocket and clasped his hands behind his back, staring at the victim's pale, still face framed by dirty curls. He turned to Lestrade, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as if he were speaking of a book left half-read on his shelf. It is too precise for a random killer, too disciplined, but something feels different here. Lestrade swallowed, glancing at the body before quickly looking away. "What do you mean, Holmes?" Holmes did not answer. His gaze traveled along the alley walls, reading stains, scratches, and soot patterns as if they were words on a page. Then his eyes returned to the body, lingering on her open mouth where damp air clouded her exposed teeth. He stepped forward once more, leaning down, his dark hair falling over his forehead as he peered closer at something tucked inside. His breath rose in a faint white cloud in the cold morning air, mixing with the faint lantern light that trembled against the bricks. Without another word, he reached forward with slender fingers and gently extracted a scrap of newspaper stuffed into the woman's mouth, the ink smeared and damp. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the shaky letters drawn in thick, dark strokes. His expression darkened, though his face remained calm. He read the words again, each letter carving deeper into the quiet fog around them. Holmes stood up straight, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers as a gust of morning wind moved through the alley, chilling them both to the bone. He did not speak for several long moments. Only the sound of a distant horse snorting against its bit and the soft hiss of gas lamps burning filled the silence. Finally, he turned to Lestrade, folding the paper and sliding it into his coat pocket. "We must return to Baker Street immediately. There is something here that goes beyond imitation, Lestrade. Something darker, something that knows exactly what it is doing." Lestrade nodded silently, and together they stepped out of the narrow alley, leaving behind the silent corpse beneath the fading lantern glow, as Whitechapel awoke to another day under the quiet terror of an ancient name that refused to die. The journey back to Baker Street was silent. Lestrade sat opposite Holmes in the small cab, staring blankly out into the swirling morning fog. The iron-rimmed wheels clattered softly over uneven stones, shaking the wooden cabin with a rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo their own unsettled thoughts. Holmes sat still, elbows resting on his knees, fingers steepled before his lips. His eyes were half closed, not in rest, but in silent calculation. The narrow streets of Whitechapel slipped past them in a blur of soot-stained brickwork, slanting rooftops, and black iron fences wet with dew. Here and there, lanterns still burned low outside narrow lodging houses, their flickering orange glow fading as dawn brightened the mist to a cool gray. When they reached Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson was already up, sweeping the hallway with short, brisk strokes of her straw broom. She paused as the two men entered, her thin face tightening when she saw Lestrade's drawn expression and the dark set of Holmes' eyes. Without a word, she stepped aside, allowing them passage up the stairs to the sitting room. Holmes removed his coat and hat with uncharacteristic haste, draping them across the back of his chair. Lestrade followed, rubbing his palms together to bring warmth back into his stiff fingers. The fog had left small beads of water across Holmes's hair, and he brushed them away absently as he moved to his writing desk. The room smelled of old smoke, dust, and faintly of last night's black coffee now gone, bitter and cold in the porcelain cup near the window. Holmes removed the scrap of damp newspaper from his coat pocket and spread it across the polished oak surface of the desk. The ink had bled in places, leaving dark smudges between the words, but the message remained clearly legible. "The children have begun." Lestrade stood at his side, reading the words over his shoulder. His throat tightened as he spoke. Children. What in God's name does he mean by that? Holmes did not respond. His gaze swept the uneven letters, taking in the deliberate sharpness of each stroke. The force used to press the ink into the paper, tearing tiny fibers along the lines. He could almost see the writer crouched somewhere dark, scrawling the words with a trembling hand, the smell of blood and damp stone heavy around them. He reached for his magnifying glass and studied the letters more closely. The pen nib had left deep indentations even through the back of the paper. The writer had pressed hard, almost violently, driving the tip down with such force that in one place it had torn clean through the dampened scrap. Holmes set the glass aside and leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping rhythmically against the arms. The ticking of the mantel clock filled the silence, each small metallic click marking a second that passed without comfort. Lestrade moved to the window, staring out at the thinning fog as it revealed rows of tall brick buildings and narrow alleys below. The city slowly waking to its usual clatter of hooves, distant market calls, and the hiss of coal fires being stoked to life. But beneath all those sounds lay something darker that morning, an unseen thread of dread winding through London's waking heart. Holmes spoke quietly, almost to himself. "The children have begun." This is not Jack's voice. His notes were taunting, dismissive, filled with confidence in his own superiority. This is different. A warning, perhaps, or a proclamation. He stood suddenly, the legs of his chair scraping against the carpet. Moving to the fireplace, he stood with one hand resting on the cold stone mantel, staring down at the dying embers within. The faint warmth rising from the ashes felt insignificant against the chill settling through the room. Lestrade turned to face him, his eyes still shadowed with dread. "Holmes, if it is not Jack, then who?" Holmes did not move for several moments. Then he turned slowly to Lestrade, his gaze clear and hard. "Someone who wishes to become him, or perhaps someone who sees himself as his heir. An imitator is dangerous enough, Lestrade, but a disciple, that is far worse." He walked back to the desk, lifting the note once more, holding it up to the gray morning light filtering through the thin curtains. The letters seemed almost to pulse in the dimness, alive with quiet menace. "This is a message to us, Lestrade, a signature of intent. Whoever wrote this wants to be seen, wants us to know that they are not merely copying Jack, but continuing what he began." Lestrade swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the brim of his hat. He felt suddenly as if the fog outside had entered his chest, filling him with cold, heavy dread. Holmes folded the note carefully, sliding it into a small leather pouch, alongside other clippings and scraps of evidence. Then he turned back to Lestrade, his face calm, but his eyes alight with dark understanding. "Prepare yourself, Lestrade. We are not facing a mad butcher in the night. We are facing a mind that believes it has a purpose, and the will to make that purpose real." Outside, the morning continued to brighten, casting pale silver light across Baker Street. But within the small sitting room, the shadows only grew longer, stretching quietly across the carpet, across the walls lined with silent books and papers, and across the hearts of two men who knew that darkness never truly leaves London. It only sleeps and waits for someone to wake it once more. The morning wore on as Holmes paced slowly across the Persian rug, his steps silent despite the boards creaking softly beneath its woven threads. The pale light streaming through the window revealed floating dust motes, turning the sitting room into a quiet theater of drifting specks and faint shadows. Lestrade sat in Watson's empty chair, hat resting on his knee, watching Holmes with uneasy patience. Neither man spoke for nearly half an hour. The only sound the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the muted voices of city sellers drifting through the window from Baker Street below. Finally, Holmes stopped near his large oak bookshelf. His eyes traveled across dozens of well-worn volumes stacked in uneven towers, treatises on pathology, surgical anatomy, criminal psychology, works in Latin, Greek, German, and French, their leather spines cracked and faded with age. He scanned quickly before selecting a slim black-bound notebook with no title on its spine. Opening it, he flipped through pages filled with tiny looping script in black ink, each line a reference to prior crimes he had investigated over the years. Lestrade leaned forward, his thick fingers drumming lightly against his hat brim. "Holmes, do you truly believe this is a copycat?" Holmes did not look up. He continued turning pages, scanning old notes on prior violent offenders, the pattern of their crimes, their mental tendencies, their psychological signatures left behind like fingerprints in words and wounds. No, Lestrade. Copycat is too small a word. What we are dealing with is not someone merely imitating. It is someone venerating. He turned another page, stopping at a short paragraph he had written nearly a decade prior, summarizing a psychological study of criminal idolization. He read it silently, then snapped the notebook shut with a quiet finality. A man who imitates seeks attention. A man who worships seeks meaning. There is a vast difference. Jack the Ripper's original murders were committed by a man who wished to cleanse his world through his own twisted perception of power. But a disciple acts not to feel powerful, but to remain loyal to the ideal of the one they worship. Lestrade felt the chill rise through his chest again, prickling the back of his neck. He stood and walked to the fireplace, holding out his hands to the fading warmth of the dying coals. The air inside Baker Street felt heavy, despite its safety, thick with unspoken fears that gathered like a second fog. Holmes moved to his large work table and unfurled a roll of thick paper tied with twine. Inside were sketches, charcoal impressions, and anatomical drawings sent from Scotland Yard earlier that morning. He spread them out carefully, smoothing their curled edges. The crime scene sketches revealed the victim's wounds in stark monochrome, shaded with careful precision by a police artist. Holmes leaned closer, his sharp eyes reading every contour of each cut, as if reading a coded letter. Lestrade watched from the hearth as Holmes placed his fingertips gently along the inked lines representing the throat incision. His brow furrowed slightly, and he tilted his head in quiet thought. He then shifted his gaze to the abdominal wound, following the long, clean sweep of the blade's imagined path. His eyes darkened as he leaned back. The Ripper was left-handed. These cuts were made by a right-handed killer. Lestrade turned sharply, surprise flashing across his face. "Are you certain?" Holmes gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible. He stood in stillness for a moment, letting the realization settle into the quiet room around them. Same ferocity, same anatomical precision, different dominant hand. That means we are dealing with a man who has studied Jack's methods, likely in excruciating detail. Lestrade swallowed, the faint pop and crackle of cooling embers filling the silence between them. Then, someone is imitating him. Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the sketches laid before him. Slowly, he drew in a breath, the rise and fall of his chest calm despite the words that came next, or worshiping him. His voice dropped to a whisper at the final word, almost lost beneath the sound of an approaching carriage clattering along Baker Street below. He closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering his thoughts into a single clear thread, then reached for his magnifying glass, resting near the sketches. Tilting it under the morning light, he studied faint markings along the victim's neck. Small scratches surrounded the main wound, each thin as a hair, shallow and precise, almost ritualistic. Lestrade approached quietly, leaning closer to look. Holmes spoke again without lifting his gaze from the drawings. "This killer is not acting out of rage, Lestrade. He is performing. Each cut is as deliberate as a surgeon's, and yet these scratches around the wound, they are not exploratory. They are ceremonial, decorative even." He lowered the magnifying glass, his features set in a grave, focused calm. Whoever he is, he believes these murders are part of something far larger than himself. For a moment, neither man moved. The city sounds beyond Baker Street returned to their ears. The call of the newspaper boy hawking the morning edition, the distant shout of a coal merchant, the rumble of heavy wheels against stone. But here, in the quiet of Holmes's sitting room, it felt as if the world had stopped, pausing to listen to the ancient terror rising once more from the shadows of Whitechapel. Holmes set the magnifying glass down with careful precision, aligning it beside his ink pot. He straightened, shoulders square, eyes distant in thought. "Prepare yourself, Lestrade. This is no mere murderer. This is the birth of something far more dangerous." The inspector nodded silently, feeling the weight of those words settle deep within him. Outside, the sun rose higher through the thinning fog, revealing the bustling life of London waking once more. But within Baker Street, the morning felt dark and still, for the Ripper's shadow had found a new form, and it walked now not as a man alone, but as an idea reborn. For the rest of the morning, Holmes remained at his work table, head bent over old police reports and anatomical diagrams spread in neat columns across the oak surface. He moved with methodical precision, arranging each paper in logical sequence, creating a timeline that mapped the descent of London's darkest legend into its newest horror. The pale sunlight filtering through the window had grown warmer by late morning, illuminating the faint swirling patterns of pipe smoke that drifted lazily around him. Lestrade stood near the hearth, silent, staring down into the cold ashes of the extinguished fire. He felt the same heavy dread that had filled him during those first murders all those years ago, when Jack had carved his message into the soul of London with each merciless strike. But this felt different, deeper, as if something that had slept within the city's stones had awoken again, wearing a new face, but the same old darkness. Finally, Holmes lifted his gaze from the papers, his pale eyes sharp with thought. He removed his reading glasses, folding them with quiet precision before slipping them into the inside pocket of his waistcoat. Then he reached for a thin stack of letters bound with twine and flipped quickly through their contents. The papers were old, the edges browned and fraying. Each was a police intelligence report dated in the years following the Ripper murders. Lestrade glanced over, curiosity and unease mixing in his voice. "What are those?" Holmes spoke without looking up, scanning the pages with swift focus. "Intelligence summaries collected by Scotland Yard in the years after the final canonical Ripper murder. They include informant statements, local rumors, and unverified sightings." He stopped at one letter and read it more closely. The paper was thin, almost translucent in the sunlight. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the words. Then he set it down on the table with a deliberate motion, tapping its edge lightly. "Here it is, the seed of what we are facing today." Lestrade stepped closer, leaning down to read over Holmes's shoulder. The note described a gathering of men in a dockside tavern near Wapping, speaking in hushed tones about Jack the Ripper. They called him the Midnight Surgeon and referred to his work with admiration, as if he had done what they themselves only dreamed. The report ended with a brief conclusion from the investigating sergeant, dismissing the men as drunken braggarts seeking attention through vile stories. Holmes picked up another letter. It spoke of a small group in Spitalfields who gathered annually on the anniversary of Mary Jane Kelly's death, leaving coins and small knives on her grave as offerings. Another note described boys in the East End trading lurid tales of Jack by candlelight in abandoned buildings, daring each other to sleep in places where his victims were found. Holmes placed the final letter down and turned to Lestrade, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that filled the room. "The murders did not simply end with Jack's disappearance, Lestrade. The killings ended, but the legend did not. Over the years, underground groups have formed, some small and harmless, petty criminals seeking terror in a name. Others, darker, groups who see Jack not as a murderer, but as a force, a cleansing force. Lestrade swallowed, feeling his mouth go dry. The gas lamps outside flickered as a small breeze passed along Baker Street, sending faint, shifting shadows across the sitting room walls. Holmes continued, pacing now, his hands clasped lightly behind his back. For these men, Jack is no longer just a killer. He is a myth, an idea that justifies their own hatred and rage. A cult formed around him is no different than any other cult built upon blood. There is ritual, there is devotion, and there is sacrifice. Lestrade's voice dropped to a whisper, thick with disbelief. You are saying they worship him? As if he were a god? Holmes turned sharply to face him, the movement sudden, his eyes narrowed with calm certainty. Not a god, a prophet of death. They see his murders as scripture. Each cut, each mutilation, a verse in their twisted gospel. The words hung in the room like smoke, dark and choking. Lestrade moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to gaze down at the busy street below, where merchants unloaded crates from carts and children ran barefoot along the edges of the pavement. Life continued in blissful ignorance of the gathering shadow beneath their feet. Holmes stood silent for a moment, watching Lestrade's reflection in the window glass. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, resonant with thought. Most of these groups remain hidden in rumor and drunken fantasy, but if even one has evolved beyond talk, if even one has become organized, that is far more dangerous than a lone killer in the night. Lestrade closed his eyes, pressing his fingertips against the glass, feeling its faint coolness ground him in the moment. God help us, Holmes. Holmes turned back to the table, gathering the letters into a neat stack once more. He tied the twine back around them with quick, precise movements, then placed them in the small brass drawer beneath his work surface. When he straightened, his face was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet resolve. We are no longer looking for a single murderer, Lestrade. We are looking for a doctrine, a belief system that demands blood as proof of faith. He paused, then added almost softly, as if speaking to himself, and those are always the most dangerous to stop. Outside, the late morning sun finally broke fully through the lifting fog, sending pale beams of light across Baker Street. But in Holmes's sitting room, the light did little to warm the growing certainty that darkness had returned to London, wearing the mask of worship and bearing blades sharpened by devotion. 2 nights later, the fog returned to London with a vengeance, sweeping in from the Thames under a waning moon. It crept along narrow streets and coiled into alleyways thick and low to the ground, swallowing the glow of gas lamps until only dim halos remained in the blackness. The entire city seemed muffled, the clatter of carriage wheels hushed, footsteps fading almost before they sounded. Holmes had barely slept in those 2 days. He spent hours cross-referencing old Ripper case files with new reports, comparing wound angles and incision lengths, studying sketches and autopsy notes by candlelight long into the silent dawns. His violin rested untouched in its case by the window, and the familiar scent of resin and polished wood lay dormant in the room. Even his coffee sat cold in the cup on his work table, forgotten amidst the paper and ink that consumed his thoughts. Lestrade arrived at Baker Street just after midnight, his face drawn with exhaustion, his mustache still damp from the fog outside. He did not knock, but entered quietly, removing his hat as if afraid to disturb something sacred within the silent sitting room. Holmes sat by the fireplace, his lean frame draped in a dark dressing gown, fingertips pressed lightly together beneath his chin. His eyes flicked up to Lestrade's reflection in the dark window before him. Lestrade spoke in a quiet, hoarse whisper. "Holmes, there has been another murder." Holmes did not turn, but his posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Where?" "Behind an abandoned gin house off Hanbury Street. Same wounds, same." Note: Holmes stood in a fluid motion, the dressing gown falling open to reveal his trousers and crisp white shirt beneath. He crossed the room with silent steps, lifting his coat from its hook and slipping it on with practiced precision. He picked up his felt hat and walking stick, then paused to blow out the flickering candle on his work table. The room fell into darkness, save for the faint orange glow of the dying coals within the hearth. They said nothing more as they descended the stairs. Outside, the fog swallowed them instantly, cold and wet against their cheeks, their breath rising in faint clouds that disappeared into the heavy gray darkness. Lestrade led the way down silent streets where only distant barking dogs and the shuffle of an unseen beggar broke the stillness. Their footsteps echoed briefly before the fog absorbed them completely. They arrived at Hanbury Street shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning. Police lanterns burned low along the alley beside the gin house, their dim light turning the swirling fog into moving walls of gray shadow. The gin house itself was boarded shut, its sign hanging crooked, letters peeling in thin strips revealing rusting nails beneath. Rats darted among discarded barrels, their scurrying claws scratching softly against the damp stones. The body lay behind the building, near a crumbling brick wall blackened with soot. A thin wooden fence lined the narrow yard, broken in places to reveal the dark shapes of stacked, empty crates and rotting burlap sacks. The smell reached Holmes before he saw her. The familiar copper tang of blood mixed with the sharp stink of human waste and decaying refuse. It hung in the air so thick he felt it coat the back of his throat. The victim was young, no more than 20. Her throat had been cut clean through in the same precise motion as the first. Her abdomen opened from sternum to pelvis with a single confident stroke. Her skirt lay bunched around her hips, the blood pooling beneath her, forming a dark mirror that reflected the dim orange glow of the lantern above. Holmes crouched near her side, his eyes scanning each detail with a surgeon's focus. Her hands were clenched into small, tight fists. The left palm showed faint purple bruising, as if someone had grabbed her wrist hard before she died. He examined the cut itself, same depth, same angle as the previous victim. His eyes narrowed as he traced the incision line with his gaze, memorizing each millimeter before moving to her face. Her mouth was open, her lips dry and cracked in the cold night air. Within, stuffed deep enough to fill her throat, was another folded scrap of newspaper. Holmes reached for his leather gloves tucked inside his coat pocket and slipped them on before removing the note with quiet care. He unfolded it under the lantern's dim glow. The ink was darker than before, thick and fresh, smeared only slightly by blood. The letters were broad and sharp, the edges pressed deep into the paper fibers by an unsteady but forceful hand. Holmes read the words slowly, each syllable etching itself into the cold night around him. The children see all. He stared at the note for several long moments, hearing nothing but the faint drip of blood from her open wound falling onto the whetstone below. Then he folded it precisely and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat, rising to his full height. Lestrade approached, keeping his eyes fixed firmly on Holmes to avoid looking at the victim. His voice was hushed, almost lost in the rustling of the fog around them. But it is the same man. Holmes shook his head very slightly, his gaze still locked on the silent shadows beyond the alley fence. No, Lestrade, it is the same purpose. He turned back to the body, scanning the ground around her feet. The mud was churned in places, footprints leading away into the darkness of the yard. Holmes knelt again, brushing his gloved fingers lightly over one imprint. The tread was shallow, the heel narrow. He noted the angle of the steps, the faint drag of a toe in the mud. Then he rose again, his coat brushing softly against his legs as he turned to Lestrade. "We must return to Baker Street immediately. Have your men guard this scene and every street leading from it. No one enters or leaves without record." Lestrade nodded without speaking, his face pale in the lantern glow. Holmes stepped into the swirling fog, his silhouette long and thin beneath the flickering gas lamp. As he walked away from the crime scene, he felt the silent eyes of Whitechapel watching him from broken windows and darkened doorways. A city holding its breath beneath the heavy shadow of a name that refused to remain buried in history. And in that quiet hour before dawn, Sherlock Holmes felt the chill certainty that darkness had only just begun to wake. Dawn arrived with a bleak, colorless light that barely pierced the dense fog clinging to Whitechapel's narrow streets. Holmes had not returned to his bed. Instead, he spent the entire remainder of the night standing at his tall work table in Baker Street, studying the folded note retrieved from the victim's mouth. The paper lay beneath his magnifying glass, held in place by two slender brass weights, while he leaned over it with silent intensity, his shadow stretching long across the worn carpet as the gas lamp burned low beside him. Lestrade had fallen asleep in Watson's armchair just before sunrise, his chin tucked against his chest, his breathing rough with exhaustion. He woke with a start as Holmes spoke suddenly into the quiet room. "Wake up, Lestrade. We are leaving for the crime scene again." The inspector rubbed his face roughly, trying to banish the fog of half-sleep. He stood, his knees stiff from hours bent at an awkward angle, and reached for his hat. Holmes was already pulling on his overcoat, the dark wool draping cleanly over his narrow shoulders as he moved with deliberate speed. Outside, Baker Street was silent under the early morning haze. Milk carts rattled faintly in the distance, their iron rims scraping the damp cobblestones, and a lone dog barked once before fading into the muffled city sounds. They walked swiftly through the streets, their steps echoing in the fog like quiet drumbeats, until they reached the alley near Hanbury Street, where the second victim had been discovered hours before. Police lanterns still burned low at either end of the narrow yard, casting thin orange beams through the drifting mist. The smell of blood had faded slightly with the night air, but a metallic scent remained, clinging to brick and damp earth. Holmes crouched near the body's previous location, scanning the churned mud for signs missed in the darkness. He traced one footprint with his gloved finger, feeling the shallow indentations and the small stones embedded in the soil. His gaze followed a faint trail leading away from the main scene, deeper into the clutter of rotting crates stacked against the gin house's brick wall. Lestrade stood behind him, silent, watching Holmes's eyes move with quick, precise focus. Holmes shifted to his left, kneeling in a small puddle of cold rainwater that soaked through the wool of his trousers at once. He ignored the chill. Instead, he leaned closer to a set of shallow impressions pressed into the damp earth near a broken barrel. They were small, no longer than the length of his palm, and thin at the heel. He studied the shape carefully under the faint light. The tread pattern was rough and uneven, the sole worn down to near flatness, but the size and angle were unmistakable. Another set lay beside them, facing the first, pressed slightly deeper into the mud. Lestrade stepped closer, peering over Holmes's shoulder, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. "What is it?" Holmes replied without turning. Two sets of footprints, both small, both fresh, when the ground was still soft with last night's rain. both standing here for some time, watching. Lestrade frowned, trying to see what Holmes saw in the confusion of overlapping tracks. Children? Holmes nodded once sharply, his gaze still locked on the prints as he rose to his full height. His knees cracked softly as he straightened, the damp soaking through his trousers into his skin. Yes, children's boots, both no larger than size 3, likely aged between 8 and 12. Lestrade felt the chill rise up his spine and settle at the base of his neck. The fog around them swirled and shifted in the faint breeze, making the yard seem alive with unseen movement. But why would children be here, watching a murder? Holmes turned to him, his face pale in the weak dawn light, his eyes narrowed with quiet understanding. Because, Lestrade, they were not merely watching. They were meant to see it. Whoever is orchestrating these killings wants the children present. They are part of his ritual. Lestrade swallowed, his mouth dry despite the damp air. A constable approached quietly through the fog, nodding with respectful caution before speaking. "Inspector, we have searched the entire yard." "Nothing else of note, sir." Lestrade thanked him with a nod, his mind still reeling from Holmes's words. Holmes turned away from the prints and looked back toward the alley's entrance, the dim light outlining his thin silhouette against the swirling mist. He spoke softly, almost to himself, though Lestrade heard each word with clarity that made his chest tighten. They were here, standing in silence, learning. Whoever this man is, he is training them, preparing them to see death not as horror but as normal, as purpose. For a long moment neither man spoke. The fog drifted around them in silent veils, curling over crates and fences, swallowing the faint glow of lanterns, until only Holmes's dark shape remained clear in the dim morning yard. And in that quiet, as a thin breeze rustled scraps of old newspapers along the stones, both men understood the truth settling over them like the fog itself. This was no longer just a hunt for a murderer. It was the unraveling of a design far larger, darker, and colder than either had faced before. The return journey to Baker Street felt longer that morning. Fog still pressed against the cab windows, forming thin beads of moisture that slid slowly down the glass like silent tears. Lestrade sat across from Holmes, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh, his thoughts weighed down by what they had seen in that muddy yard. The rhythmic rattle of the cab wheels over cobblestones filled the silence between them. Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the blurred shapes of houses and lamps drifting past. His face was pale in the dim interior light, lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. Though his eyes did not move, his mind turned rapidly through possibility after possibility, constructing silent deductions as swiftly as any spoken word. When they arrived at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson met them at the door with quiet concern in her eyes. She offered tea, but Holmes walked past her without a word, ascending the stairs 2 at a time and disappearing into his study. Lestrade followed with a weary nod, removing his hat and coat before entering the warm sitting room where the scent of stale pipe smoke and cold coffee lingered in the morning air. Holmes stood at his writing desk, flipping quickly through the pages of a small black-bound ledger he kept tucked between volumes of medical journals. Its pages were filled with neat, looping script, lists of informants, names of cab drivers, landlords, and ward nurses he had cultivated as quiet sources over the years. Finally, he found what he sought, and snapped the book shut with a decisive motion. He turned to Lestrade, his eyes bright with cold focus. "We must go to Scotland Yard immediately. There is something I need from their archives." Lestrade nodded, too tired to question him. The two men descended once more into the waking streets, now busier with carts clattering past, vendors arranging baskets of pears and cabbages outside their shops, and groups of men gathered on corners, reading the morning papers with expressions of grim fascination. At Scotland Yard, Holmes walked with quick strides through the main hall, his coat billowing behind him. Officers parted silently in his wake, whispering to each other as he passed. Lestrade followed, the heavy echo of his boots mixing with Holmes's quiet steps on the polished stone floor. Inside the archives, Holmes requested the most recent missing children reports from Whitechapel and Spitalfields. The archivist, a thin man with round spectacles perched at the end of his nose, raised his eyebrows in quiet surprise, but retrieved the ledgers without question, sliding them across the worn oak counter. Holmes flipped the heavy volumes open, scanning page after page with swift precision, his right index finger trailing down each column of names and dates. Finally, he stopped, tapping 3 entries in quick succession. Here, 3 boys disappeared from the same parish orphanage in Spitalfields within the last 2 weeks, ages between 8 and 12. Lestrade leaned over his shoulder to read. The names were written in careful copperplate: Samuel Bishop, age 12, Thomas Green, age 10, Edward Wyatt, age 8. Each entry ended the same way. Final sighting noted by the matron in the early morning, bed found empty by breakfast, no belongings missing, no sign of forced exit. Holmes closed the ledger slowly, the sound of the heavy cover meeting the wooden counter echoing in the quiet archive room. These boys matched the footprint sizes at both murder scenes. They were not merely passing children. They are connected. Lestrade shook his head, struggling to make sense of it. But Holmes, if these boys were present at the murders, what could that mean? Why bring children to such horrors? Holmes turned to him, his gaze sharpened by quiet certainty. Because whoever is behind this wishes to shape them, Lestrade, to break them down to nothing, then rebuild them as his own disciples. Children can be trained to see death as a purpose, if shown often enough. And with no parents to protect them, orphans are easy prey for such a mind. He paused, the ticking of a nearby brass clock filling the silence between their words. The smell of old paper and oil lamps settled heavy around them. Holmes lifted the ledger again, carefully tearing out the page with the 3 names before folding it into his coat pocket. We go to the orphanage now. I need to know who last saw them, and what darkness may have already reached their young lives. Lestrade nodded, his face grave, and together they turned away from the quiet order of Scotland Yard's archives, stepping once more into the chaos of London's waking streets. The fog had thinned under the mid-morning sun, revealing the city in sharp grays and browns, soot stains on brickwork, and the restless movement of people who lived each day unaware that in the shadows of their world, children were being stolen and shaped into something far colder than any darkness they had ever known. The hansom cab rattled east through Spitalfields, its wheels clattering over cracks in the stone roads worn down by decades of trade carts and nightcabs. Holmes sat silently, his eyes half closed as he leaned back against the thinly padded seat, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. The folded ledger page rested in his coat pocket, like a silent reminder of urgency. Beside him, Lestrade watched the streets drift past, narrow alleys lined with dripping laundry, soot-blackened brick houses crowded together in sagging rows, and thin children with bare feet darting between crates and barrels, their eyes hollow with hunger. The orphanage appeared after a sharp turn onto a quiet street bordered by brick walls. A faded wooden sign hung crooked over the iron gate. Its peeling white paint read St. Margaret's Parish Orphanage for Boys. The building behind the gate was tall but narrow, 4 stories of soot-streaked yellow brick, with small square windows lined in cracked white paint. Its roof sloped unevenly, dark tiles missing in patches, revealing damp underlayers of wood that would rot by winter if left unrepaired. Holmes stepped down first when the cab stopped, paying the driver with a silent nod. As he approached the entrance, he noticed the stone steps leading up to the heavy oak doors were worn smooth in the center from decades of small feet ascending and descending under watchful eyes. Inside, the air smelled of boiled oats, damp wool, and the faint ammonia bite of cleaning lime. The hallway was long and narrow, lined with hooks for coats and shelves stacked with scuffed leather shoes in uneven pairs. A thin brown runner carpet ran its length, threadbare in places, the pattern almost invisible from wear. They were met by the headmistress, Mrs. Agnes Whitley, a tall, thin woman with hollow cheeks and graying hair pulled back into a severe bun that pulled the soft, lined skin around her temples. She wore a dark brown wool dress buttoned to the neck, its cuffs frayed at the wrists despite careful mending. Her eyes were pale blue and slightly reddened, as though sleep had eluded her for many nights. She spoke softly, her voice trembling around each syllable as she led them down the hall. "You wish to speak of the boys, Samuel, Thomas, and Edward." Holmes nodded once, his gaze flicking across the narrow hallway, observing every small detail. Children's drawings pinned unevenly along the walls, each scribbled in black pencil, depicting stick figures, crosses, and rows of uneven brick buildings. Some showed people lying flat with what appeared to be red smudges on their chests or throats. One depicted a tall, thin figure standing above smaller shapes, arms spread wide. Mrs. Whitley noticed his gaze and swallowed hard before continuing. They were quiet boys, polite. Samuel, he had been here 3 years. Thomas, only a year. Edward arrived just 4 months ago. They kept to themselves mostly, sat together at meals, said their prayers each night without complaint. Her voice faltered, and she stopped walking near a closed wooden door marked Dormitory 1. Holmes studied her with calm patience, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice low and even. "Tell me about the morning they disappeared." She nodded quickly, her thin fingers twisting together at her waist as she gathered her memory. It was a Tuesday. The cook came to wake the boys just after dawn, as she always does. Their beds, they were empty, neatly made. Their shoes were gone from the shelf by the door. We searched the entire building and the yard. No one saw them leave. There was no note, no broken locks. They simply vanished. Holmes tilted his head slightly, studying the lines of grief and guilt etched into the woman's face. He saw exhaustion there too, deep and heavy, the kind that settled into a person's bones and never left. Lestrade spoke quietly from behind him. Did they have any visitors in the weeks before? Anyone asking for them by name? Mrs. Whitley shook her head slowly, her thin bun quivering with emotion. No visitors. These boys, they had no family left to visit them. Only us. Only each other. Holmes turned and walked past her, pushing open the dormitory door with silent precision. The room inside was long and narrow, with 2 rows of small iron-framed beds lined up against opposite walls. Each bed was neatly made with thin gray blankets pulled tight across straw-stuffed mattresses. A single window at the far end let in a pale wash of morning light, illuminating the faded blue paint peeling from the plaster walls. He moved down the aisle between beds, scanning each small bedside locker. Most held only a folded handkerchief, a Bible, and a small bar of brown soap. When he reached the final 3 beds along the left wall, he paused. In one locker lay a folded scrap of newsprint cut into a square. Holmes lifted it gently, unfolding it with gloved fingers. On its inner surface was a smudged drawing in black pencil. 3 small stick figures stood beneath a towering figure drawn in heavy, dark strokes. Around them were scattered smaller shapes with crosses drawn over each one. In the stick figure, children's hands were what appeared to be small curved lines, knives. Lestrade stepped closer, his breath shallow. What is that meant to be? Holmes studied it for several long moments, the quiet creak of the orphanage building settling around them like whispers. It is what they saw, Lestrade, or what they were shown. He refolded the paper and slipped it into his pocket before turning to Mrs. Whitley, his expression calm and controlled. "Thank you, madam. We will do all we can to find them." She nodded, her pale blue eyes filling with tears that she quickly blinked away. Holmes inclined his head slightly in farewell, then walked briskly down the narrow hallway, past the scuffed shoes and silent hooks, out into the cold, fog-bound street once more. As they stepped into the sharp morning air, Lestrade pulled his coat tighter around his chest. The fog moved like restless smoke through the streets, hiding the eyes that watched them from curtained windows and dark alley gaps. Holmes paused at the iron gate, looking back at the orphanage's sagging brick facade. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "Someone is gathering the forgotten Lestrade, the lost, and he is turning them into something far darker than any child should ever become." And with that they walked away, leaving behind the silent halls of St. Margaret's Parish Orphanage, unaware that within its walls lingered the echo of small voices praying each night to a God that would never hear them, while beyond, in the hidden places of London, another master listened instead. The walk back to Baker Street was silent. Holmes moved quickly through the thinning morning fog, his long stride slicing across cracked pavements slick with mist. Lestrade struggled to keep pace behind him, boots slapping against shallow puddles left by the night's damp chill. The streets of Spitalfields slowly gave way to wider roads lined with tall stone buildings, shopkeepers lifting metal shutters, and chimney smoke curling gray ribbons into the pale sky. When they reached Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson was waiting in the entry hall, her hands clasped tightly before her apron, eyes full of unspoken questions. Holmes nodded a brief greeting before climbing the stairs 2 at a time, his coat still buttoned tight against his chest. Lestrade followed, giving her a small, weary smile, before disappearing up the stairwell. Inside the sitting room, the morning light spilled in through thin drapes, illuminating the familiar clutter. Old newspapers stacked under the windowsill, glass bottles with chemical residue lined across the mantel, and Holmes's violin resting silent in its case atop the side table. The fire had long burned out, leaving only cold gray ash in the grate. Holmes did not remove his coat. Instead, he walked directly to the center of the room and stood before the large map of London pinned to the far wall. Rusty thumbtacks marked various crime scenes, forming a chaotic constellation of violence across the East End. He scanned it silently for several long minutes, his right hand resting lightly against his chin, fingers tapping an absent rhythm against his jaw. Lestrade lowered himself into Watson's armchair with a weary sigh, resting his hat on his knee. He watched Holmes move with the same quiet intensity he had witnessed for over a decade, that silent process of observation, deduction, and integration only Holmes possessed. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low and resonant in the quiet room. "This is no simple imitator, Lestrade. This is structured, organized, purposeful." He turned from the map, walking to his writing table, where he retrieved the folded drawing found in the orphan's locker. Unfolding it carefully, he laid it flat upon the table, smoothing its edges. The thin paper trembled slightly under his fingertips. Someone is taking orphans, Lestrade. Boys with no family to protect them. Boys no one will search for beyond the bare minimum of duty. He is taking them and shaping them into his instruments. Lestrade leaned forward, brow furrowed. Instruments for what? Holmes's eyes flicked up to meet his, gray and sharp as cut flint in the morning light. Murder. He tapped the drawing once, lightly, indicating the towering dark figure surrounded by the three small children holding knives. This is ritualistic, symbolic. The murders themselves are designed not only as acts of violence, but as acts of instruction. These children are being taught that death is their calling, their purpose. He paused, drawing in a slow breath, the creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots filling the silence. This is no longer about fear alone. This is about creation. Whoever is behind this believes he is building something that will endure beyond him, a legacy of violence and devotion. Lestrade shook his head slowly, staring down at his hands. God above, Holmes. Children, innocent children. Holmes's gaze softened almost imperceptibly as he looked at his friend. Then his expression hardened again with cold focus. Innocent? Yes. But if we do not stop this man soon, they will not remain so for long. Their innocence is being used as a weapon against themselves. And once they are broken, they will carry out any command given to them without question. He turned away, walking back to the map of London. His eyes scanned the pinned tacks once more, tracing invisible lines between each mark, seeking a pattern beneath the chaos. His coat fell in silent folds around his legs as he stood motionless, the morning light casting his silhouette long across the floorboards. Lestrade's voice came quietly from behind him, hoarse with dread. What does he want, Holmes? What is the purpose of all this? Holmes did not turn as he answered, his voice low, almost a whisper. Fear, control, worship. The Ripper believed himself above the law, above morality, above the ordinary terrors of men. But this man, he wants more. He wants to become not only the Ripper's successor, but his prophet, his teacher, his creator of a new breed of darkness. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The faint sounds of Baker Street drifted up from below, carriage wheels rattling on stone, merchants calling their morning prices, a milk cart driver whistling softly as he carried bottles to the steps of tall row houses. But within the quiet of Holmes's sitting room, the world felt still, heavy with a knowing dread. For beyond the comfort of those thin curtains and warm wood walls, someone moved unseen through London's alleys and cellars, someone who believed that from the broken bodies of the forgotten he could build an army of shadows. And as Holmes stood there, silent and unmoving before his map, he knew that if they did not find him soon, Whitechapel would once again drown in fear. Only this time, its terror would not vanish with the dawn. Evening settled over London with a quiet, suffocating heaviness. The fog had thinned, but the air remained damp and cool, carrying the sense of coal smoke, wet stone, and the faint acrid tang of horse sweat drifting from the streets below. In Baker Street, Holmes lit a single lamp on his writing table, casting a warm, golden pool of light across the clutter of sketches, notes, and crime scene photographs arranged with precise intention before him. Lestrade stood at the window, staring down into the darkening street. Lamps flickered to life along the pavements, their glass globes glowing with trembling orange flames. Shadows stretched long between each pool of light, creating gaps of darkness where anything could wait unseen. The inspector's face was pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed beneath heavy brows, as he watched the quiet movement of evening life continue, beneath a sky turning the color of bruised plum. Behind him, Holmes remained silent, studying the drawing found in the orphanage for the fifth time that hour. He turned it over once more, examining faint indentations on its reverse side, lines pressed through by the pencil's sharp tip, though they revealed no words or hidden symbols, only pressure marks where a small hand had held the page still as it drew. He set it down and reached instead for the folded murder notes retrieved from Scotland Yard. Spreading them before him, he moved his gaze slowly from one to the next. His right hand tapped an absent rhythm against the table's edge as his eyes flickered with silent calculation. Lestrade turned from the window, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Holmes, how far do you believe this man will go? Is it simply to recreate Jack's terror, or is it something worse?" Holmes did not look up as he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Worse, much worse." He paused, selecting a crime scene sketch from the Dorset Street murder. He studied the angle of the victim's neck wound, the position of her arms, and the folded scrap of newspaper stuffed into her mouth. Then he spoke again, each word falling with the heavy certainty of iron nails driven into wood. "This is no longer about murder, Lestrade. It is about myth. It is about building something that cannot die, a shadow that will outlive him, outlive me, outlive London itself." He lifted his gaze then, eyes catching the lamplight with a sharp clarity that sent a chill through Lestrade's chest. Jack the Ripper created fear that ended when his blade fell silent. This man, he is building fear that will not end with him, because he is creating disciples to continue it, children who will become men knowing nothing but darkness, violence, and devotion to his cause. Lestrade swallowed, his throat dry despite the damp chill drifting through the window cracks. He lowered himself heavily into Watson's armchair, the old leather creaking beneath his weight. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke. "God help us, Holmes. What if they are building an army?" Holmes remained silent for a long moment, his gaze locked on the flickering lamp flame before him. The quiet tick of the mantel clock filled the room, marking each passing second with cold precision. Finally he spoke, his voice calm and almost gentle, though every syllable carried the weight of iron. "That is precisely what worries me, Lestrade." He turned back to the notes, his long fingers moving swiftly across the pages, rearranging them into new configurations, seeking patterns beneath chaos. The lamp cast his shadow large upon the wall behind him, thin and angular, merging with the lined spines of his books and the dark edges of chemical bottles and glass slides arranged in silent ranks upon the shelves. Outside, the city continued to settle into evening calm. The last cries of costermongers faded into the distance, shutters closed with quiet thuds, and lamps burned softly against the gathering dark. But within Baker Street, the quiet carried no comfort, for both men understood that somewhere beyond their window, hidden in the depths of Whitechapel's silent cellars, the Ripper's shadow was growing once more. Only this time, it wore many small faces. Holmes rose before dawn the next morning. He had slept only briefly in his armchair, his coat draped over his shoulders, his head resting against the worn leather back. The lamp on his writing table still burned low, casting a thin orange glow across his sharp features, and the papers scattered before him like fallen autumn leaves. Lestrade had left hours earlier to coordinate with Scotland Yard, though his promise to return before noon remained unspoken between them. Outside, the first faint grays of morning slipped between the heavy curtains. London lay silent under a sky of pale iron, the fog having retreated to the riverbanks, leaving behind cold, damp streets streaked with last night's rain. Holmes dressed quickly, pulling on his crisp white shirt and dark waistcoat before fastening his collar with mechanical precision. He tied his black cravat with practiced ease, then reached for his coat and hat resting upon the side table. He moved quietly through the room, selecting his walking stick from the stand by the door. Before leaving, he paused for a final moment beside his violin case. Gently, he placed the folded drawing retrieved from the orphanage into a narrow compartment within the case's lid, as if protecting it from the outside world. Then he closed it with a soft click and stepped out into the silent dawn. The hansom cab carried him back to Hanbury Street, where the second victim had been found behind the abandoned gin house. The alleyway remained cordoned off, a thin length of frayed rope stretched between rusted nails, hammered into the brick walls. 2 constables stood guard, their breath curling in small white clouds as they nodded silent greetings to Holmes. He lifted the rope with his gloved hand and ducked beneath it, stepping into the narrow yard, still heavy with the lingering chill of death. The ground remained damp from the prior evening's rain. Holmes walked slowly along the edge of the gin house wall, scanning each brick with quiet precision. The mortar between them was dark with moisture, flecked with coal soot and thin green moss in places where the sun never reached. Near the corner where the wall turned sharply towards a broken wooden fence, his gaze froze upon a faint irregularity in the brick's dark surface. He crouched low, balancing effortlessly on the balls of his feet. There, near the ground, partially hidden by an old burlap sack leaning against the wall, was a thin scrawl of white chalk. He reached out, lifting the sack away to reveal the full message. The letters were uneven and jagged, written in a child's unsteady hand. The chalk had crumbled in places where the dampness had eaten into it overnight, but the words remained clear enough to read, "In the cellar, he teaches us S." Holmes read it once silently, then again, each letter carving itself into his mind with quiet finality. He stood slowly, brushing flecks of wet grit from his gloved fingertips, his expression calm but shadowed by dark understanding. The constable nearest him cleared his throat, speaking with cautious curiosity. "What does it say, sir?" Holmes turned to him, his eyes reflecting the faint glow of the lantern hanging from the fence post behind them. "It says everything we need to know. These murders are not the end, Constable. They are only the beginning. The killer is not working alone. He is building something beneath us, a world hidden from London's eyes." He paused, his gaze traveling down the length of the alleyway, past broken crates and discarded barrels, to where the shadows gathered thickest among the dim dawn light. And he is building it in the dark. Holmes walked quickly back to the street, stepping into the growing flow of early morning carts and bundled workers moving towards market. His boots clicked sharply against the wet stones as he moved with silent purpose, his coat billowing around his knees in the cold breeze rising from the river. The fog had begun to return, curling through alleyways like restless smoke, but Holmes did not slow. He knew with cold certainty that each hour that passed brought the children deeper under the killer's influence. And though he had seen many men commit acts of darkness, the idea of a mind willing to mold innocence into blades struck him with a rare chill that settled deep in his chest. As he hailed a cab back to Baker Street, he replayed the message again and again in his thoughts. In the cellar he teaches us. And he knew that before this ended, they would have to descend into those depths to find the teacher who carved devotion from fear and forged children into shadows. By late afternoon, the fog had thickened once more, rolling in from the Thames in heavy, low-lying waves that swallowed the narrow streets of Whitechapel whole. The lamps flickered weakly against its dense gray walls, each halo of orange light floating like a distant ship lantern in the mist. Carriage wheels rattled past, their iron rims sending echoes bouncing down silent alleyways lined with dripping brick and broken shutters. Holmes sat in Baker Street, silent for nearly an hour, his elbows resting on his knees, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin. Across from him, Lestrade paced slowly before the fireplace, his boots scuffing lightly against the worn carpet. The lamp burned low on the writing table, illuminating the scrap of chalk message Holmes had retrieved that morning. Finally, Holmes stood, the suddenness of his movement halting Lestrade's pacing at once. Without a word, he crossed to the corner of the room where his tall cabinet stood against the wall. Unlocking it, he retrieved a short steel lantern, its glass pane smudged with old soot. He checked its small oil canister, then slipped it into his coat pocket. Next, he reached for his black leather gloves and pulled them on with quiet precision, each tug of the fingers deliberate and calm. Lestrade watched him with silent understanding. "We are going down there tonight, then?" Holmes nodded once, sharply. "If he is building this beneath the city, it will be somewhere no one enters without purpose. An abandoned cellar, an old brewery perhaps, somewhere with tunnels and chambers large enough to house more than a few children." He turned to the table, picking up the folded orphanage drawing and sliding it carefully into his inside pocket. The children said, "In the cellar he teaches us. They will be underground." Lestrade exhaled slowly, feeling the tightness in his chest grow heavier. "Where do we begin looking? The East End is a labyrinth of old cellars." Holmes tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp with focus. "We begin with the largest abandoned structure nearest the murder scenes, and in Whitechapel. That is the old Whitbread Brewery cellars beneath Brick Lane." Without another word, he lifted his lantern, his walking stick, and moved swiftly towards the door. Lestrade grabbed his hat from the side table and followed, feeling the cold draft of the evening hallway brush against his neck as they descended the narrow stairwell. Mrs. Hudson stood at the foot of the stairs, worry etched across her lined face, but Holmes passed her with only a small nod. She clutched her hands together tightly as she watched them leave, the front door closing softly behind them. Outside, the evening fog swallowed them instantly. They moved through the streets quickly, their coats billowing around their legs, boots clacking sharply over slick stones. Small groups of men stood huddled near pub doors, their voices low, their pipe smoke curling upwards to merge with the restless fog. No one paid Holmes or Lestrade any mind as they passed. When they reached Brick Lane, the street was nearly deserted. The old brewery loomed above them, its stone facade blackened by decades of coal smoke. Its arched windows, boarded tight with gray wood, splintered at the corners. Ivy climbed its western walls in thick brown ropes, twisting into broken window frames and iron drain pipes streaked with rust. A single sign still swung faintly above the locked front gates, its letters almost invisible in the dimness. Whitbread and Cuppies Bocas, established 1742. Holmes moved to the side of the building, following a narrow alley that ran between the brewery and a row of dilapidated brick houses. Here, the ground sloped downwards towards a rusted iron grate set into the stone foundation. He crouched, lifting the lantern to examine its padlock. The lock was old, coated in black grime, but the scratches around its shackle were fresh. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a slender brass pick, sliding it into the keyhole with deft, silent movements. Within moments, the lock clicked open. Holmes lifted the grate slowly, the rusted hinges squealing softly into the damp evening air. A cold draft of stale, earth-scented air rose to meet them, carrying with it the faint smell of rotting wood and damp limestone. Lestrade stepped forward, peering down into the darkness beyond. A narrow stone stairway descended steeply into a black void that swallowed their lantern light before it reached the bottom. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his revolver heavy in his coat pocket. "God help us, Holmes! What do you expect to find down there?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He lifted the lantern, tilting it to cast its thin beam into the stairwell's depths. The flickering glow revealed slick stone steps, damp with condensation, descending into silent darkness. He looked at Lestrade then, his voice low and calm, though his eyes burned with quiet certainty. "Whatever darkness Jack the Ripper left behind, Lestrade, this is where it has chosen to make its home." And with that, he began his descent into the old brewery cellars, each step carrying them deeper beneath the city, into the silent heart of shadows, where children's voices whispered prayers to a teacher no god would ever claim. Holmes led the way down the narrow stone stairwell, his lantern held low before him. Its small flame cast trembling shadows along damp brick walls, illuminating patches of slick moss and streaks of old soot that stained the descending archway. Each step echoed softly beneath their feet, absorbed almost instantly by the heavy, silent air that pressed close around them. The scent changed as they descended further. The sharp tang of rust and damp limestone deepened into something older, a dense smell of rotting wood and stagnant water that seemed to cling to the stone itself. Their breaths fogged in the cold, mixing with the thin lantern smoke, curling upward with each silent exhale. When they reached the cellar floor, the darkness felt complete beyond the thin circle of flickering yellow light. The ceiling arched low, constructed of soot-blackened brick laid in wide curved vaults. Small rivulets of moisture dripped from cracked mortar lines, pooling in shallow depressions across the uneven flagstone ground. Wooden casks lay scattered in silent ranks, their iron hoops rusted through, their wood splitting in slow decay. Holmes moved forward swiftly but silently, his boots landing with careful precision upon each stone. He paused beside a fallen cask, brushing its surface lightly with his gloved fingertips. The dust lay thick over it, undisturbed by footprints or hand marks. He continued deeper into the cellar, lantern sweeping left and right, as he searched the shadows for signs of disturbance. Lestrade followed close behind, his right hand resting on the butt of his revolver within his coat pocket. His eyes darted across every shifting shadow, each creak of wood above them and distant drip of water echoing like a whisper through the silent underground. They reached a low archway where the cellar narrowed into a single stone corridor lined with rotting barrel racks. Holmes paused, raising his lantern higher to examine the dark brick walls. There, half hidden behind a collapsed rack, he saw it, a section of brickwork that did not match the rest. The mortar lines were cleaner, straighter, and the bricks themselves slightly lighter in color, as if they had been laid far more recently than the crumbling surrounding walls. Holmes crouched before it, setting his lantern down upon the damp stone floor. He pressed both palms against the wall, running them lightly along the brick surface, feeling for any gap or catch. Near the bottom left corner, his fingers paused. He pressed gently, and a soft scraping sound filled the narrow corridor. Slowly, the brick swung inward, revealing a narrow passage hidden behind them. Its entrance was no wider than Holmes's shoulders, just tall enough for him to pass through with his head bowed. Beyond the hidden door, a dim flicker of orange glow reached their eyes, illuminating rough stone walls that descended yet deeper into the earth. Lestrade exhaled shakily, the sound of his breath loud against the silence of that secret place. A hidden room. Here, under the brewery? Holmes did not turn as he reached for his lantern, lifting it once more and stepping through the concealed entrance. His voice came quiet and even, though the cold edge of focus within it made Lestrade's chest tighten. No, not a room, a sanctuary. They moved slowly down the narrow passage, their footsteps echoing off close stone walls. Melted candle stubs lined the floor along both sides, their wax pooled and hardened across old wooden boards placed like makeshift flooring. Some candles still burned with thin, flickering flames, illuminating smudges of black soot upon the ceiling where smoke had curled up to stain the rough stone. The corridor widened gradually, opening into a low-ceilinged chamber perhaps 10 feet across. The stone walls were rough and uneven, slick with condensation. Along the far wall stood a stack of broken crates and rotting barrels arranged in a haphazard barrier. Holmes stepped forward, examining it with quick, sharp eyes. He pressed lightly against one crate, then another. The third shifted under his hand, revealing a thin crack of darkness behind it. He turned to Lestrade, his voice low and controlled. "Help me move these aside." Together they shifted the crates, their rough wood groaning softly under their grip, flakes of rot falling to the stone floor like brittle autumn leaves. When the final barrel rolled aside, it revealed what lay beyond, a false brick wall built roughly into the stone arch. Its mortar lines were uneven and fresh, some bricks set crookedly where the builder's haste had overcome precision. Holmes reached forward, pressing his gloved fingers against the center brick. It shifted slightly beneath his touch, and with a low scrape of stone against stone, the entire section swung inward, revealing a narrow passage lit faintly by dozens of guttering candles, melted down to pale wax-coated stubs. The smell hit them first. A dense mix of damp earth, rotting cloth, cold iron, and an underlying scent of something far darker, the unmistakable iron tang of old blood absorbed into porous stone over time. Lestrade swallowed hard, the sour taste of bile rising in his throat as he drew his revolver fully from his coat pocket. Holmes raised his lantern higher, its trembling light illuminating what lay beyond the secret door. Rows of melted candles lined both sides of the passage, their weak flames casting long, writhing shadows along the damp stone walls. Small wooden boxes sat stacked in corners, their lids cracked open to reveal old cloth scraps and bits of rusted metal tools. Scraps of yellowed newspaper were pinned to the walls with iron nails, each page scrawled over in thick black ink with words that repeated again and again in uneven, frantic script. "The children will cleanse. The children will cleanse." Holmes moved forward silently, stepping deeper into the hidden passage as the shadows flickered across his sharp, angular features. His eyes burned with quiet intensity, scanning each crude mark upon the stone walls, each melted candle stub, each rusted tool laid out with ritualistic precision. He turned slightly to Lestrade, his voice calm and low, though every syllable carried a quiet finality that left no room for hope. "This is not merely a hiding place, Lestrade. This is an altar." And with that, he stepped forward into the darkness, the silent flame of his lantern, leading them deeper into the secret heart of London's oldest terror. Holmes stepped forward into the narrow passage, the flickering lantern light casting his thin shadow long behind him, merging with Lestrade's as they moved deeper into the silent, secret world beneath Whitechapel. Each of their footsteps echoed softly along damp stone, a hollow, rhythmic cadence that seemed to mark their descent into something far older and darker than mere crime. The passage curved left after several paces, the melted candle stubs growing more numerous along the rough floorboards, laid haphazardly to keep feet from the icy stone beneath. Their flames burned low and wavering, casting trembling golden light upon the walls. Holmes's eyes scanned every inch of stone as they passed, the soot smudges from old candle smoke curling upward in thin black fans, the faint scratches near floor level where boxes or barrels had been dragged, and the stray black threads caught upon splintered wooden beams protruding from between the bricks. Finally, the narrow passage opened into a low-ceilinged chamber. Holmes paused just before stepping inside, raising the lantern to illuminate its entire breadth. Lestrade inhaled sharply behind him, his breath whistling through clenched teeth at what lay before them. The room was larger than Holmes had anticipated. Nearly 20 feet across, it was constructed in a rough oval, its curved walls blackened by decades of coal soot and damp rot. The vaulted brick ceiling dripped with condensation in places, each slow, rhythmic drip landing upon the stone floor with a quiet, hollow plink that seemed deafening in the heavy silence. Against the far wall stood what could only be described as an altar. Its base was formed from broken crates, stacked in uneven layers, the wood darkened by age and moisture. Upon these crates rested a flat surface built from old wooden doors, stripped from their hinges and nailed crudely together. Melted candle wax pooled thickly along the edges, dripped down in hardened rivulets like frozen tears, and collected in pale mounds upon the stone floor. Atop this altar lay an array of objects that chilled Lestrade to his bones. Rusted knives of all sizes and shapes, cleavers, curved blades, paring knives, and thick butcher's blades, each darkened with old stains. Between them lay rotting flowers, their shriveled petals blackened and dry, their thin stems tangled together as if woven into ritual offerings. Scattered among these were scraps of wood carved with shaking, childlike etchings. Each depicted the same figure, a tall, thin man with an elongated head and stick-thin limbs, arms spread wide above smaller shapes crouched below him. Many of the drawings were stained with dark smudges, as though someone had dipped a thumb into ink or something darker and smeared it deliberately across the wood before placing it upon the altar. Holmes stepped forward slowly, his boots making no sound upon the rough floorboards as he approached the altar. He crouched before it, holding his lantern low to examine the offerings more closely. The flickering light revealed fine details upon the wood carvings, jagged lines radiating from the tall figure's head, resembling a crude halo. In several pieces, the smaller shapes below the figure were carved with small horizontal lines across their throats, each line darkened with what appeared to be soaked-in pigment. Lestrade remained near the chamber entrance, the barrel of his revolver trembling slightly in his grip despite his efforts to steady it. His eyes scanned the room, catching upon other disturbing details. In the corners, old blankets lay folded upon rough straw mats, indicating that people, or children, had slept here. Empty tins of cheap preserved meat and stale bread crusts lay discarded near the far wall, gnawed clean and dented inward. The smell was heavy with rot and damp earth, but beneath it lay the thin metallic bite of old blood soaked into porous stone. Holmes reached out with gloved fingers, lifting one of the rusted knives from the altar surface. Its edge was jagged and blackened, but its handle showed signs of recent use. Fingerprints smudged into the thin layer of grime, streaks of dark residue along its hilt. He turned it slowly under the lantern light, watching the faint glimmer dance across its rust-pocked blade. Then he placed it back down with quiet precision and rose to his full height. His eyes traveled along the curved chamber walls. Faint scrawls of words covered the brickwork in uneven childlike lettering drawn in black ink or soot. Many repeated phrases over and over in trembling lines. The children will cleanse, the children have begun. Father Gideon saves us, Father Gideon teaches us. Lestrade's voice came low and hollow, as if pulled from deep within his chest. "Father Gideon, who in God's name is he?" Holmes turned his gaze upon Lestrade, his eyes shadowed under the lantern's thin glow. His voice was quiet, though each syllable carried the calm certainty of a man laying down irrefutable truth. "The man who has built this, the man who has taken Jack the Ripper's darkness and forged it into doctrine, a teacher, a prophet, a leader of children who know nothing of love or hope, only fear, ritual, and his twisted salvation." He turned back to the altar, scanning its surface one final time. At its center lay a single folded scrap of newspaper placed upon a small square of blood-stained cloth. Holmes reached for it slowly, lifting it to read in the lantern's trembling light. The ink was thick and black, pressed deeply into the paper with a heavy hand. Its words were simple, but they carried a chill that even the damp stone and old blood could not match. "Tonight he will call us forth." Holmes folded the note precisely, sliding it into his coat pocket beside the orphan's drawing. Then he turned to Lestrade, his voice calm but resonant with quiet urgency. "This is no longer theory, Lestrade. This is liturgy, and tonight we will see its final sermon." Lestrade tightened his grip upon his revolver, feeling the cold steel bite against his palm. The candle flames flickered around them, casting thin shadows that danced like silent spirits upon the damp walls. And in that quiet underground chamber, surrounded by rotting flowers, rusted knives, and the trembling echoes of children's handwriting, both men understood that they had descended beyond crime and into the ancient silent heart of worship. A worship built not upon mercy or love, but upon darkness, blood, and the broken innocence of the forgotten. Holmes stood motionless before the altar, his lantern casting flickering golden light across his sharp features. The silence in the hidden chamber pressed against their ears with a thick, suffocating heaviness. Each candle flame bent and straightened, with the faint underground drafts, casting shadows that twisted and merged into the curved brick walls, creating the illusion of dozens of figures watching them from the darkness. Lestrade moved slowly along the chamber's edge, his revolver raised in a steady grip before him. The chill of the iron seeped into his fingers, grounding him against the nauseating scents filling the room. Damp stone, rotting wood, stale candle wax, and that thin metallic bite of old blood, lingering over everything like an invisible veil. Holmes crouched by the altar once more, scanning the scattered offerings laid across its stained wooden surface. Between the rusted knives, rotting flowers, and child-carved wooden scraps lay small cloth pouches tied with rough twine. He picked one up and untied its knot with calm precision, emptying its contents onto his gloved palm. Tiny bones clattered softly against his leather, small, thin, and dry, likely from rodents or pigeons, yet arranged with quiet, deliberate reverence. He replaced them silently upon the altar. His gaze swept left and right, scanning each candle stub melting wax into pale lakes upon the rough boards. Then, suddenly, his entire posture changed. He froze, head tilting slightly to one side, eyes narrowing with intense focus. Lestrade noticed at once. "What is it, Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he rose to his full height in a single fluid motion and turned towards the far end of the chamber. His lantern illuminated a narrow brick archway, partially concealed behind stacked crates and broken barrel staves, leaning haphazardly against the wall. The wood was damp and blackened by rot, giving off a pungent odor of decay. Holmes stepped forward, brushing aside the debris with his walking stick. Beyond the archway, a short passage descended into a darker chamber below. The air rising from it felt colder, heavier, as if something within drew warmth and light inward, swallowing both without mercy. Then, from within that black passage, came a sound that made Lestrade's blood turn to ice. Footsteps, small, deliberate, unhurried, the quiet scuff of bare feet upon damp stone. Holmes lifted his lantern higher, illuminating the mouth of the passage. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the darkness. 5 children stepped forward in a silent line, each appearing no older than 12. Their clothes hung from their thin frames in ragged strips of brown and gray cloth, damp and stained with soot and earth. Their bare arms and ankles were streaked with grime, revealing bruises and thin scratches upon their pale skin. But it was their eyes that stilled both men. Wide, glassy, and empty. There was no flicker of fear, no spark of defiance or hope. Only silent obedience, as if whatever lay within them had been scooped out and replaced with something cold and endless. The first child, a boy of perhaps 10 with matted black hair falling over his eyes, stepped fully into the lantern's glow. In his small right hand, he held a curved knife, its blade dulled by rust but sharpened along the edge. 4 other children followed, each gripping a similar blade. A girl with tangled blonde hair stood beside the first boy. Her thin shoulders trembled with each shallow breath, but her grip upon the knife never faltered. Behind them came 2 smaller boys, each with their eyes locked upon Holmes and Lestrade in vacant stillness. The final child, a boy of perhaps 12 with hollow cheeks and bruised knuckles, held his knife across his chest as if in solemn prayer. Lestrade raised his revolver higher, his voice trembling despite his effort to remain steady. "Dear God, Holmes, what have they done to them?" Holmes lowered his lantern slightly, illuminating their thin, bare feet pressed against the damp stone, toes curled under against the chill. He spoke softly, each word deliberate and resonant in the silent chamber. "They have stripped them of childhood, Lestrade, and replaced it with devotion." As he spoke, the children remained unmoving. Only the gentle rise and fall of their chests betrayed life within them. Their knives gleamed dully in the wavering light, thin curls of rust flaking from their edges onto small trembling fingers. Then, from the darkness behind them, a faint sound broke the silence, the slow scraping of a boot upon stone, followed by a quiet, rasping breath. Lestrade stepped back instinctively, his revolver still trained upon the children. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he shifted his lantern towards the passage behind them. Emerging from the shadows came a tall figure, thin as a withered tree, draped in a tattered black preacher's coat that brushed the damp stone floor with each measured step. His skin was pale and stretched tight across high cheekbones, and his unkempt hair fell in thin strands to his shoulders. Beneath his dark brow burned 2 fever-bright eyes, wide and glistening with fervor. He raised his arms slowly in greeting, long fingers spread wide, palms stained dark with old soot or blood. When he spoke, his voice was low and hoarse, but carried with it a quiet, pulsing certainty that chilled Holmes deeper than any knife could pierce. "Welcome, Mr. Holmes. We have waited for you." The children did not turn towards him. They remained facing Holmes and Lestrade, their knives raised before them in silent devotion. Only their eyes flickered with something new now, not hope nor fear, but the faint glimmer of anticipation. As if they understood in some small hidden part of their broken minds that the final lesson was about to begin. And in that silent underground room, lit only by flickering candles and a single trembling lantern, Holmes felt the ancient chill of a darkness far older than Jack the Ripper's legend. The darkness of faith twisted into worship, of innocence shaped into silent weapons, and of children taught to kneel not before love, but before the cold, unblinking face of death itself. Holmes held the lantern steady before him, its flickering glow illuminating the gaunt figure standing behind the line of silent children. For a moment, no one moved. The candles burned low along the stone walls, their trembling flames casting wavering shadows across the man's thin face. His eyes, deep-set and shining with an unnatural brightness, scanned Holmes with rapt fascination. Lestrade kept his revolver raised, his finger curled tightly around the trigger, though he knew that in a room filled with children, each holding a blade, any shot risked unleashing chaos they could not control. The tall man stepped forward, his tattered preacher's coat whispering against the stone floor. Its hem was frayed and blackened by years of grime, its brass buttons tarnished to dull brown circles. Around his neck hung a thin iron chain, and upon it dangled a small rusted scalpel, the blade darkened by old stains, the handle worn smooth by countless touches. His lips curled into a thin smile as he regarded Holmes with what appeared to be genuine reverence. "Mr. Holmes," he rasped softly, his voice low and cracked with fervor, "the teacher of reason, the unraveler of men's secrets. We have spoken of you so often." Holmes's gaze remained calm, though the lantern light revealed a tightening of his jaw as he scanned the man from head to toe, noting every twitch of his fingers, the slight tremor in his thin neck, the irregular rhythm of his breathing. He observed how the man's eyes flickered occasionally towards the children, checking them, as if ensuring they remained in their exact positions. It was the glance of a shepherd counting his flock, not a father concerned for their well-being. Lestrade spoke before Holmes could reply, his voice steady but hard. "Who are you? What is this?" The tall man turned his gaze upon Lestrade, his smile widening, revealing yellowed, uneven teeth framed by cracked lips. He spread his arms wide, the sleeves of his coat hanging like draped shrouds around his bony wrists. "I am Father Gideon," he said, his voice rising with quiet triumph. "I am the prophet of Jack's work. I carry his sacred teachings forward into a new age. These children, they are my lambs, the purest among the unclean. They will cleanse this city of its rot. They will become his children, the Ripper reborn not in one man but in many." Holmes narrowed his eyes, studying every word as it fell from the man's trembling lips. Father Gideon. The name scrawled upon the bricks in the cellar, the name written in children's jagged chalk upon damp walls, the name whispered in terror behind the silence of missing orphan reports. He stepped forward once, placing himself slightly in front of Lestrade, the lantern held low to keep the light from blinding his opponent. His voice was calm, quiet, almost gentle, though every syllable was edged with iron. "And what is it you teach them, Father Gideon? That death is devotion, that fear is faith?" Father Gideon tilted his head slightly, his thin hair falling away to reveal the deep hollows beneath his cheekbone. His eyes burned brighter now, wide and unblinking in the trembling candlelight. "I teach them purity, Mr. Holmes. I teach them freedom from weakness, from hunger, from the loneliness of the streets above. Down here, they are his children. They are loved in a way the world never offered them. Jack showed us the way. He showed us that cleansing must begin in blood." He gestured softly towards the 5 children standing in silent formation before him. Their knives remained raised across their chests, their eyes fixed upon Holmes with vacant obedience. "They have seen death," he continued, his voice trembling with devotion. "They have held the knife. They have felt the warmth of life leaving another. They fear nothing now, not even me." Lestrade shifted his weight uneasily, his revolver following the preacher's movements with silent precision. Holmes studied the children's faces, their small frames trembling in the cold, their lips slightly parted with each shallow breath. He noticed thin scars along their wrists, faint lines of old burns along their forearms, and bruises darkening beneath grime upon their shins and ankles. He looked back at Father Gideon, his expression calm, but his voice low with a quiet, contained fury. You have stolen their lives from them, their minds, their hope. You have made them into killers. Father Gideon smiled wider, revealing pink, inflamed gums. His eyes shone with tears as he raised his thin arms towards the damp, soot-blackened ceiling above them. No, Mr. Holmes, I have given them purpose. I have made them unbreakable. They will go forth into the city. They will cleanse its filth. And when London sleeps, it will sleep under the watchful shadows of Jack's children. He lowered his arms, his long fingers curling into trembling fists. The iron scalpel hanging from his chain swung lightly with the motion, its dark blade catching a faint glimmer from the lantern's flickering glow. Holmes shifted slightly, placing his left foot half a step behind his right. His posture relaxing, though his eyes never left Gideon's gaunt face. He could hear Lestrade's breath quicken behind him, each exhale controlled but shallow. Holmes spoke again, his voice quiet and even, though behind it lay the sharpened steel of truth. They are not shadows, Gideon. They are children, and I will not let you keep them in your darkness any longer. Father Gideon's eyes narrowed. His smile faded, replaced by a thin line of silent rage. His gaze flicked quickly from Holmes to Lestrade, then back to the children. His right hand twitched at his side, fingers curling and uncurling in small, rapid movements. And for the first time, Holmes saw it. Beneath the flickering candlelight, behind the mask of prophetic devotion, lay a mind stretched thin by its own madness, a mind that believed utterly in its purpose, a mind that would burn every child to ash if it meant fulfilling its twisted gospel. For a long moment, the chamber remained silent, broken only by the soft drip of condensation falling from the arched ceiling onto damp stone. Then Father Gideon's thin lips parted once more, and he spoke in a whisper that filled the room with quiet finality. Then, come forward, Mr. Holmes, come forward and witness the birth of Jack's kingdom. And as he raised his trembling hands towards the children, Holmes felt the entire silent chamber tighten around them like a coiling serpent, the thin air thickening with the unspoken promise of blood, devotion, and death waiting in the flickering candlelight. Father Gideon stood before them, his thin arms still raised, fingers spread wide, as if reaching for some unseen blessing falling from the soot-stained bricks above. The children did not move. They remained lined up before him in silent ranks, each small hand gripping a curved rusted blade across their thin chests. Their eyes reflected the flickering candlelight with the glassy emptiness of sleepwalkers trapped between worlds. Holmes lowered his lantern slightly, letting its glow wash over the preacher's gaunt face. He studied every detail, the deep lines carved into his hollow cheeks, the bruised shadows beneath his fever-bright eyes, the thin sheen of sweat clinging to his sallow skin despite the damp chill of the underground chamber. The scalpel upon its iron chain swung gently across his chest with each breath, tapping softly against the black fabric of his rotting preacher's coat. Holmes spoke, his voice calm and even, each syllable resonant in the heavy silence of the cellar. "What is your true name?" Father Gideon lowered his arms slowly, his thin fingers curling around the rusted scalpel hanging from his chest. He ran his thumb along its dulled blade, eyes never leaving Holmes's face. "I was born Gideon Price," he said softly, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and devotion. "But I died as a child, Mr. Holmes. Jack gave me life again. He showed me the truth of this world, that filth breeds in shadows, that sin festers in flesh, and that only through cleansing does the soul find silence." Lestrade shifted behind Holmes, his revolver aimed directly at the preacher's sunken chest. His voice was tight with disgust. "You think cutting the throats of women and training children to kill is cleansing?" Father Gideon's gaze flicked briefly to Lestrade, a faint smile curling the corners of his cracked lips. "You see only the blood, Inspector. You do not see the freedom, the release. Each death tears away the veil of civility that binds us in lies. These children, they are unbound. They fear nothing, not death, not pain, not the betrayal of family or the poison of hunger." He turned his gaze back to Holmes, eyes shining with tears now, though his thin smile remained. "They belong only to him now, to Jack, and through me his work is eternal." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his lantern casting trembling shadows across the stone floor strewn with melted candle wax and discarded cloth scraps. Then he spoke softly, almost gently, though his words cut deeper than any blade could hope to pierce. "Jack left nothing behind but fear. You have taken that fear and turned it into worship. But worship is still fear, Gideon, fear given structure, and you are still only a frightened boy kneeling before a darkness you never understood." Father Gideon's face twitched once, a small involuntary spasm beneath his right eye. His thumb pressed harder against the scalpel blade, enough to split the thin skin and send a bead of dark blood sliding down its dulled edge. He seemed not to feel it as he smiled wider, his teeth yellowed and sharp against his cracked lips. "You are wrong, Mr. Holmes. I am not afraid. I am his prophet." His voice dropped into a low whisper, tremoring with fervor, as he raised his blood-smeared thumb and drew a thin line across his forehead. "He came to me when I was a boy, cowering under the workhouse stairs while my father's blood dried upon my skin. He showed me that death is freedom, that pain is nothing, that only blood has truth." The children shifted slightly at the sound of his voice, as if the words moved through them like a cold wind stirring dead leaves. Their vacant eyes flickered with faint reflections of candlelight, their thin chests rising and falling in trembling synchrony. Father Gideon's gaze locked with Holmes's once more, wide and burning with tearful devotion. "He lives in me, in them, and through their hands his kingdom will rise again. London will remember his name, not as a murderer, but as the father of their salvation." Holmes lowered his lantern further, letting its light spread across the silent children lined before the altar. His voice remained calm, though it resonated with quiet sorrow as he spoke. "They are children, Gideon, not soldiers, not shadows. You have stolen their humanity to serve your delusions." Gideon trembled now, his thin frame shaking with quiet laughter as tears spilled down his hollow cheeks. "No, Mr. Holmes, I have given them purpose. I have given them a father who will never abandon them." He raised his thin arms once more, palms outstretched towards the children. His voice dropped into a soft, melodic whisper that echoed through the damp chamber like a funeral hymn. "Children, show Mr. Holmes the truth of his words." And as he spoke, the children slowly raised their rusted knives higher before them, their vacant eyes fixed upon Holmes in silent, obedient devotion. The candle flames flickered wildly as their small blades caught the light, glinting with a promise that chilled even Holmes to his core. For in that trembling underground silence, surrounded by shadows and melted wax, Sherlock Holmes understood fully what they faced. Not merely a killer, not merely a cult, but a man who had taken London's darkest legend and forged it into faith. And in that faith, built an army of innocent souls shaped into perfect, unbreakable weapons. Holmes did not move. He stood before the silent line of children, the lantern in his hand, casting its flickering golden glow across their thin, trembling faces. The cold underground air pressed close around them, thick with the smells of damp stone, candle wax, and the faint iron tang of old blood absorbed into the ancient bricks. The children's knives remained raised, small rusted blades quivering lightly in their hands. Their eyes remained locked on Holmes, glassy, vacant, unblinking. The candlelight reflected off their pupils in small, trembling points of gold that shimmered with each flicker of flame. Father Gideon stood behind them, his arms outstretched in silent benediction. Tears streaked his hollow cheeks as he whispered softly to himself, each word a quiet prayer to a God only he could hear. His thin shoulders shook with silent laughter that never reached his lips. Holmes raised his lantern slightly, illuminating the children more fully. His gaze moved calmly from face to face, studying each small scar along their wrists, each bruise shadowing their thin forearms, each faint trembling of their lips as they breathed in silent obedience. Then he lowered the lantern slowly, letting its glow fall back upon the cold stone floor. His voice came soft and even, each syllable resonant with quiet, unbreakable certainty. This ends tonight, Gideon. Father Gideon smiled through his tears, his thin lips stretching wide as his trembling hands lifted the rusted scalpel from the chain around his neck. Its blade caught the candlelight with a faint gleam despite its dull, corroded edge. His voice came low and hoarse, cracking with devotion. You cannot end what has begun, Mr. Holmes. You cannot kill faith. Holmes stepped forward half a pace, placing himself fully between Lestrade's raised revolver and the line of children. He set the lantern gently upon the damp floorboards at his feet, its thin flame trembling against the darkness that crowded around them. He spoke softly, his words carrying no anger, no urgency, only calm, measured clarity. You are not teaching them faith, Gideon. You are teaching them worship built upon fear. You are creating killers, not children of salvation. Father Gideon's smile faded. His eyes narrowed as tears continued to spill unchecked down his cheeks. He clutched the scalpel tighter. The blood from his cut thumb smeared dark along its blade. They have no fear, Mr. Holmes. That is what makes them pure. That is what makes them worthy of his kingdom. Holmes's gaze remained steady upon Gideon's fever-bright eyes. He spoke again, his voice lower now, resonating through the silent chamber with quiet authority. You are wrong. They fear one thing still. They fear you. He turned his gaze back to the children, his eyes softening as he met each vacant stare. His voice lowered further, becoming gentle, almost a whisper meant only for them. This is not what you want. This is not what life must be. You are children. You are not weapons. A faint flicker passed across the face of the smallest boy, standing at the far right of the line. His grip upon the knife faltered, his thin wrist trembling as his wide eyes shifted briefly from Holmes to Gideon. A tear slid down his grime-streaked cheek, catching the lantern light with a trembling gleam, before falling silently to the damp stone floor. Gideon saw it at once. His face twisted in rage, the thin skin along his temples pulsing as he stepped forward, raising his scalpel high in the flickering candlelight. "Do not listen to him," he shouted, his hoarse voice cracking with fury and fear. "He is filth. He is rot. He is the sickness Jack came to cleanse." Holmes did not flinch. He raised his hand slowly, palm outwards towards the trembling children. His eyes locked onto Gideon's with calm, unwavering certainty. "You fear me, Gideon, because you know I am right." Gideon screamed then, a high, tearing sound that echoed through the stone chamber like the shriek of rusted iron tearing free from centuries of silence. His thin frame trembled with violent rage as he lunged forward, scalpel raised to strike. And in that single instant, time seemed to stretch into silence. the flickering candle flames frozen in mid-dance, the children's vacant eyes widening, the trembling drip of condensation falling from the ceiling, pausing before it met the floor. Holmes did not move. His gaze remained calm, his expression still and unafraid, as if he stood not before a madman with a blade, but before a broken child clutching a wooden toy in a darkened room. Behind him, Lestrade raised his revolver higher, his finger curling upon the trigger, every muscle in his arm trembling with cold certainty. And as Father Gideon's blade fell towards Holmes's chest, the silent children watched with eyes wide and vacant, eyes that, in that trembling flicker of candlelight, seemed to see something they had long forgotten, something called hope. The moment stretched long and silent as Father Gideon lunged forward, his rusted scalpel raised high, its dull blade trembling in his thin, clenched fist. The flickering lantern light caught upon its edge, casting a fleeting glint that vanished as quickly as it appeared. His ragged preacher's coat flared around his legs as he moved, revealing dark stains and torn lining with each jerking step. Holmes did not flinch. He stood unmoving before the rushing figure, his sharp gaze fixed not on the weapon, nor on the madman's twisted face, but upon the children standing silently in their trembling line. The smallest boy, tears now streaking down his dirt-smeared cheeks, stared at Holmes with wide, unblinking eyes. His thin shoulders shook, and his grip upon the curved knife faltered, the blade lowering half an inch towards the damp stone floor. Lestrade's revolver fired. The deafening crack shattered the silence of the underground chamber. Its echo reverberated off the soot-stained brick walls, mixing with the sudden sharp cry that burst from Gideon's lips. The preacher staggered sideways, clutching his upper arm where blood blossomed dark and thick through the torn sleeve of his coat. The scalpel clattered against the stone floor, its rusted blade ringing once before spinning to a stop near Holmes's boots. Gideon howled in rage and pain, stumbling back against the damp stone wall behind him. His knees buckled, sending him sliding down until he sat slumped upon the floor, his thin chest heaving with ragged breaths. Tears streamed from his eyes, mixing with sweat and blood as he stared at Holmes with a glare that burned with feral hatred and fevered devotion. "You cannot stop it," he gasped, his voice torn and hoarse. "You cannot take them from me. They are his now. They are Jack's children. His kingdom will rise through them." Holmes lowered his gaze to the scalpel at his feet. Slowly, he crouched down and picked it up between two gloved fingers, studying the blade's dull, dark-streaked edge under the lantern's trembling glow. Then he set it down carefully upon the wooden altar behind him, beside the rusted knives and rotting flowers. He turned back to the children. They remained unmoving, but the shift was subtle and clear to Holmes's sharp eyes. Their vacant gazes flickered with confusion. The smallest boy lowered his knife fully now, letting its rusted tip rest upon the floorboards. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths, and his lips trembled as he whispered words too soft for Lestrade to hear. Holmes stepped forward, placing himself directly before them. His voice came low and calm, each syllable resonant with quiet, unbreakable certainty. "Listen to me. You are not shadows. You are not killers. You are children. This is not your purpose. This is not who you are." The boy with the lowered knife began to sob softly, his thin shoulders shaking with each silent gasp. Tears streaked clean lines down his soot-darkened cheeks, dripping onto the rusted blade clutched limply in his trembling fingers. Beside him, the girl with tangled blonde hair blinked rapidly, her wide blue eyes darting from Holmes to Gideon, slumped bleeding against the wall. Her grip upon her knife slackened, the blade slipping from her small hand and clattering quietly upon the damp stone floor. Father Gideon watched, his pale face contorted in fury and desperation. He tried to push himself up the wall, but his wounded arm gave way beneath him, sending him sprawling sideways onto the cold floorboards. He sobbed once, a broken hollow sound that echoed through the silent chamber. "No," he rasped, his voice thin and trembling. "Do not listen to him. He is filth. He is rot. He will abandon you. He will cast you away like the world above did." Holmes turned his gaze upon Gideon, his expression calm, almost sorrowful, though his gray eyes burned with cold resolve. "They are children, Gideon, and you will never speak to them again." The tallest boy, thin and bruised, his ragged shirt hanging loosely from his skeletal shoulders, lowered his knife to his side. He blinked once, twice, as if waking from a long, dark sleep. His lips parted and a single, trembling word fell from them in a voice hoarse with disuse. "Mother?" Lestrade swallowed hard, his throat tightening painfully as he lowered his revolver slightly. The chamber was silent but for the quiet sobbing of children and the ragged breathing of the fallen prophet. Candle flames flickered weakly in the damp chill, casting thin golden shadows across the cold, soot-blackened bricks. Holmes stepped closer to the line of children. He crouched before the smallest boy, reaching out slowly until his gloved fingers gently touched the boy's thin wrist. The child flinched at first, then relaxed under his quiet, unthreatening touch. His voice dropped into a whisper, each word soft but firm, with quiet promise. "No one will hurt you again. Not him. Not anyone. You are safe now. You are safe." And for the first time in that dark, hidden world beneath Whitechapel, a faint warmth flickered in the children's empty eyes. A flicker of something fragile and trembling, but alive. Something called hope. For several long moments, silence settled over the underground chamber. Holmes remained crouched before the smallest boy, his hand resting gently on the child's trembling wrist, feeling the faint flutter of his thin pulse beneath skin, chilled by damp stone and fear. The boy's tears fell steadily now, each drop landing upon the rusted blade he still held limply at his side. Lestrade lowered his revolver further, though he kept his stance firm, his eyes moving between Father Gideon, slumped bleeding against the soot-stained wall, and the 5 children lined before the altar. The candles flickered low around them, their flames dimming as melted wax pooled thick upon the rough floorboards. Shadows lengthened across the damp stone walls, swallowing the carvings of the Ripper etched into wood scraps, pinned there by children's trembling hands. Holmes raised his gaze to the other children. Their knives now hung loosely in small fingers, their wide eyes darting between him and their fallen preacher. Confusion trembled in their vacant stares like thin light shimmering beneath dark waters. Some shifted their weight from foot to foot, as if their minds had awakened, but their bodies no longer knew how to stand outside the rigid discipline drilled into them. Father Gideon groaned softly. His thin fingers clawed at the damp stone as he tried to push himself upright. Blood stained the tattered sleeve of his black preacher's coat, dripping in thin rivulets onto the wooden floor beneath him. His breath came ragged and wet, each exhale shuddering from deep within his hollow chest. Holmes turned to him, his voice low but steady, carrying the quiet certainty of truth, spoken with no need for force. "It is over, Gideon. You have lost." For a moment the preacher was silent. His sunken eyes flickered in the dim candlelight, their feverish glow trembling as tears continued to spill from their hollow rims. His lips parted slowly, revealing broken yellowed teeth beneath cracked, blood-smeared lips. "Lost," he rasped, his voice hoarse with both agony and trembling devotion. "No, Mr. Holmes, you are wrong. This is only the beginning. and with sudden, jerking violence, he lunged forward onto his knees, his uninjured hand darting beneath the folds of his tattered coat. Holmes saw the movement instantly. He rose in a single fluid motion, placing himself between Gideon and the children, his hand darting towards the hidden pocket as the preacher drew forth a small blade, a thin, curved surgical knife, its steel gleaming bright and clean, despite the grime staining his trembling fingers. Father Gideon screamed, a high, tearing sound that rang off the soot-blackened stone walls. "They will cleanse you!" He lunged forward, slashing wildly at Holmes with a thin blade. Holmes twisted his body sideways, narrowly avoiding the cutting arc of steel as it swept past his chest. The preacher stumbled forward with the force of his own swing, his thin frame crashing against Holmes's shoulder. The lantern on the ground tipped over, sending its flickering glow spinning across the chamber as shadows jumped and twisted along the damp walls. Lestrade stepped forward instantly, his revolver raised once more. But Holmes shouted sharply over his shoulder, "Do not fire! The children!" Father Gideon howled again, his voice cracking with rage and pain as he slashed at Holmes's chest a second time. Holmes caught his thin wrist mid-strike, his gloved fingers tightening with iron control. He twisted sharply, sending the small curved blade clattering across the floorboards to spin and settle, near the trembling feet of the tallest boy. The preacher's knees buckled under him, sending him sprawling sideways against the base of the altar. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he clutched his wounded arm to his chest. His eyes darted wildly between Holmes and the children lined before him, wide with terror and broken devotion. "Children," he sobbed, his voice cracking into high, trembling whimpers. "My lambs, do not forsake me, do not forsake him." But none moved. Their knives remained lowered, small hands trembling with exhaustion, and cold as tears slid silently down their bruised cheeks. The smallest boy dropped his blade entirely now, the rusted steel landing upon the stone with a quiet clink that seemed louder than Gideon's frantic sobs. Holmes crouched before the preacher, his voice calm and quiet, though every syllable carried an unbreakable command. "You have lost. Look at them. Look at what you have done. You do not lead them. You have only broken them." Father Gideon sobbed once more, his thin shoulders shaking as his forehead pressed against the rough boards beneath the altar. "No," he whispered hoarsely, his voice fading to a trembling echo in the silent chamber. "No, I saved them. I saved them." Lestrade stepped forward quickly, crossing to Holmes's side, his revolver still trained upon the trembling, bloodied man. His voice came low and hard, edged with cold disgust. "God help you, you mad bastard!" Holmes turned away from Gideon, his gaze falling upon the children. He saw their vacant eyes flicker with something new now: confusion, grief, terror, emotions they had been taught to bury, now rising silently to the surface of their broken minds. He spoke softly, his voice low and resonant in the quiet beneath Whitechapel. "It is over. No one will hurt you again. You are safe now." For a moment, the only sounds in the chamber were the preacher's ragged sobs and the quiet, trembling breaths of 5 children who no longer knew whether they stood in darkness or light. And in that cold silence, broken only by the guttering candle flames, Holmes felt the ancient heavy truth settle upon him, that evil, when clothed in faith, left scars upon innocence that neither justice nor mercy could ever fully erase. Holmes remained crouched before the trembling children, his eyes locked onto theirs with calm, unblinking focus. The flickering lantern, knocked sideways during the struggle, now lay on its side upon the damp stone floor, casting its thin golden glow upward. Shadows danced along the curved brick ceiling above them, stretching and shrinking in restless, wavering patterns, as if London's darkness itself were watching this silent reckoning unfold. Lestrade moved quickly. He kept his revolver trained upon Father Gideon as he crossed to the fallen lantern, lifting it upright to restore steady light to the chamber. The preacher lay slumped against the base of the makeshift altar, his thin chest heaving in shallow, ragged gasps. Blood from the bullet grazed along his upper arm, soaked through the torn black cloth of his coat, dripping steadily onto the rough floorboards beneath him. His eyes were wide and unfocused, staring past Holmes and Lestrade, fixed upon the line of silent children before him. He began to murmur softly under his breath. The words slipped from his cracked lips in broken, trembling fragments, a prayer torn apart by tears. "My lambs, do not fear. His kingdom will come. He will cleanse. He will remember us." Holmes stood slowly, rising to his full height with controlled, silent grace. He turned to Lestrade, his voice low but steady, resonant with quiet command. "Bring your men in now. Secure the children first, then take him." Lestrade nodded sharply. He stepped towards the hidden passage entrance and fired 2 shots upwards into the stone ceiling, sharp, deafening cracks that rang through the underground tunnels and echoed back upon themselves like muffled thunder. Within moments, footsteps sounded from beyond the hidden wall. The scrape of boots against damp stone, the clatter of lantern hooks striking iron, and the low voices of officers calling out to one another filled the passageway with urgent life. 4 constables entered the chamber in quick succession, their heavy navy coats brushing against the narrow stone archway as they passed through. Each carried a lantern in one hand and a short baton strapped to their belts. Their eyes widened as they took in the silent children lined before the altar, knives hanging limply from small trembling fingers, their bruised, tear-streaked faces locked upon Holmes with vacant confusion. Lestrade gestured sharply. "Take the children first, gently. Remove the blades from their hands, wrap them in blankets, and get them upstairs. Quickly now." The constables moved with professional efficiency, though Holmes saw grief flicker across each of their faces as they approached the children. One by one, the small rusted knives were removed from thin, trembling fingers. The smallest boy resisted at first, clutching the blade with a quiet whimper, his eyes wide with terror. Holmes stepped forward, kneeling before him, his gloved hand reaching out to gently cover the child's thin, dirt-streaked fingers. His voice came soft and even, resonant with quiet, unbreakable calm. "It is all right. Let it go. You do not need it any more." Slowly the boy loosened his grip. Tears spilled down his cheeks as the blade fell into Holmes's waiting palm. A constable wrapped a thick gray blanket around his narrow shoulders and lifted him gently into his arms. The boy buried his face against the constable's chest, his small body trembling with silent sobs as he was carried from the chamber. One by one, the children were wrapped in blankets and carried away. The girl with tangled blonde hair clung tightly to the rough wool as a young constable lifted her. Her wide blue eyes stared up at him in silent terror as she whispered a single word, barely audible. "Home?" The constable swallowed hard, blinking rapidly against the burning in his eyes. His voice trembled as he answered her. "Yes, miss. We will take you home." Lestrade turned back to Father Gideon. 2 constables moved swiftly to his side, their boots echoing against the damp wood. They bent down, gripping his thin arms with iron control as they hauled him upright. He cried out, his knees buckling beneath him, the blood-soaked sleeve of his coat dripping dark stains onto the stone floor, his head lolled forward, his matted hair falling across his sunken eyes. He sobbed softly, his thin lips trembling as he whispered in broken, gasping fragments, "You cannot stop it. They will remember him. He lives in their blood." Lestrade spoke, his voice low and cold, as he leaned close to the preacher's ear. "You will speak only to Scotland Yard now." Father Gideon let out a thin, rasping laugh that shivered down Lestrade's spine. "Scotland Yard cannot kill an idea." Holmes watched as the constables dragged him from the chamber, his thin boots scraping across the damp wood with each struggling step. The preacher's hollow laughter echoed back to them as he disappeared down the narrow passage, fading into ragged, breathless gasps that merged with the quiet sobs of children rising from the dark tunnels beyond. For a long moment, Holmes remained silent. The chamber was empty now, save for flickering candle stubs burned down to their last inch. The rusted knives upon the makeshift altar lay silent, their dulled blades catching the lantern light in thin, trembling reflection. He bent down, lifting the scalpel that had fallen from Gideon's trembling grip. Holding it beneath the lantern glow, he studied its rusted blade and cracked handle. Then he set it gently upon the altar's surface, among the other offerings of blood, devotion, and broken innocence. Lestrade returned, his boots echoing softly against the stone floor as he approached Holmes. His voice came quiet, weighed down with exhaustion and grief. "We will take him to the yard tonight. And the children, we will send them to hospital first. But what will become of them, Holmes?" Holmes did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed upon the rusted knives, the rotting flowers, and the melted wax that pooled across the altar's cracked wooden surface. They were innocent, Lestrade. Until he turned them into weapons. He reached down, lifting the lantern from the floor. Its thin flame flickered as he straightened, casting his sharp silhouette long and thin against the soot-blackened walls. And with quiet, silent certainty, he knew that London would not soon forget the children of Jack the Ripper, nor the darkness that had taught them to kill in the name of salvation. They emerged from the old brewery cellars just before dawn. The cold air of Whitechapel struck Holmes and Lestrade like a silent wave, carrying with it the mingled scents of coal smoke, damp brick, and rotting vegetables left overnight in market carts lining the empty streets. The sky above Brick Lane glowed with a faint gray light, paling slowly towards a thin orange along the horizon as London woke to another day, unaware of the horrors hidden in its depths. Holmes stepped onto the cobbled street first, the thin soles of his leather boots echoing softly in the dawn stillness. His sharp eyes swept the area with quick precision. Constables stood in small clusters, lanterns held low as they spoke in quiet murmurs. Their breath rose in pale white clouds, mingling with the fog drifting low along the gutter edges. 2 police wagons waited near the brewery gates, their black lacquered panels slick with dew, lanterns mounted upon their corners, flickering against the morning gloom. Lestrade followed close behind, his revolver holstered, but his right hand trembling slightly as it dropped back to his side. He paused at the brewery doorway, turning to watch as constables carried the children up from the cellars. Each child was wrapped in a thick gray blanket, their small faces pale and tear-streaked. Their wide, vacant eyes stared at nothing, fixed upon sights only they could see, trapped still within the silent horrors of Father Gideon's teachings. The smallest boy whimpered softly as he was lifted into a constable's arms. Holmes stepped forward, his long coat brushing the child's bare feet, as he placed a gloved hand gently upon the boy's thin, trembling shoulder. For a brief moment the boy's glassy eyes flicked upwards to meet his. Tears welled again and slid silently down his grime-streaked cheeks as he buried his face against the constable's chest, clutching the rough wool of his coat with thin, shaking fingers. Lestrade turned away, swallowing hard against the tightness burning his throat. He walked to Holmes's side, his boots crunching softly over scattered pebbles and broken glass on the cobblestone. "What will become of them, Holmes?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He stood watching the children carried into the police wagons, their small forms disappearing behind black iron doors that shut with quiet finality. He felt the dawn wind rise around him, tugging gently at his coat sleeves and carrying the distant cry of a hawker calling his morning trade down the length of Brick Lane. Finally he spoke, his voice low and even, though beneath it lay a sorrow that pulsed through every measured syllable. They will be cared for. They will be cleaned, clothed, fed. But their innocence, that has been carved from them, Lestrade. What remains now is something fragile. It will take time, perhaps a lifetime, before they remember what it means to be only children. Lestrade nodded silently. He turned to watch as two constables escorted Father Gideon towards a wagon waiting apart from the others. The preacher's thin arms were shackled before him with thick iron cuffs, his wrists bruised and bloodied. His hollow face remained lifted towards the dawn sky, his eyes wide and empty, his cracked lips moving in silent prayer. Holmes followed his gaze. As Gideon passed, their eyes met, the fever-bright stare of the broken prophet and the cold, clear gaze of the detective. For a moment, the dawn seemed to still around them. Then Gideon smiled, a thin, bloodless stretch of lips over yellowed teeth. "They will remember him, Mr. Holmes," he whispered hoarsely, though his voice carried only to Holmes's ears. "Even when I am gone, he will remain. The children will remember. London will remember." Holmes did not respond. He watched silently as the constables forced Gideon into the wagon, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a hollow finality that echoed down Brick Lane. The street grew quiet once more. The constables dispersed to their wagons, lanterns flickering out as dawn brightened to pale gold across soot-blackened bricks and broken windows. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolled 6 times, its deep chime rolling slowly across Whitechapel, stirring pigeons from their roosts along the rooftops. Lestrade turned to Holmes, his voice tired and rough with grief. "You stopped him, Holmes. Whatever madness he was building, you ended it." Holmes remained silent. His eyes scanned the awakening street before him, seeing not the thin milkman pushing carts down narrow lanes, nor the women sweeping steps before lodging houses, nor the paper boys calling headlines into the dawn. Instead, he saw 5 small faces lined before a makeshift altar in a cellar deep beneath London. He saw vacant eyes shining with candlelight. He saw rusted blades raised by trembling hands in silent obedience. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and almost distant. "No, Lestrade, I ended nothing. Evil like his does not die with him. It merely waits for another name, another face." He turned away, lifting his coat collar against the chill dawn breeze, and began the long walk back to Baker Street through streets glowing gold beneath the rising sun. And as Lestrade followed, silent and weary, he understood Holmes's unspoken thought, that in London darkness never truly ends. It only sleeps, waiting to wake again in new hands with new blades, in new shadows no lamp can ever fully chase away. Father Gideon sat slumped in the interrogation room at Scotland Yard, his thin frame trembling under the weight of soaked black cloth. His tattered preacher's coat, now stiff with dried blood, clung to his sharp shoulders like a shroud. The gas lamp mounted upon the wall flickered low, casting a dim golden glow across the narrow chamber, illuminating every line etched into his gaunt, hollow-cheeked face. Lestrade stood in the far corner, arms crossed tightly against his chest, watching the silent, broken figure with a stare of quiet disgust. Holmes sat across the table from Gideon, his long fingers steepled before his chin, elbows resting lightly upon the scratched oak surface. Papers lay spread out before him, the drawings carved by children's knives, the chalk scrawls along the brewery walls, the torn note declaring, "The children have begun." Each word, each mark, each scar of devotion laid out like scripture in a gospel of blood. For a long time, neither man spoke. The only sounds in the small chamber were the quiet drip of water from a leaking pipe beyond the stone walls, and the rasps of Gideon's breath as it wheezed in and out through cracked lips. His thin shoulders shuddered occasionally, as if the chill within him came not from the damp night air, but from something far older and deeper. Finally, Holmes spoke, his voice low and calm, each syllable measured and resonant in the stillness. "Tell me why, Gideon? Why them? Why children?" For a moment Gideon remained silent, staring down at his shackled hands resting upon the table's scarred surface. His thin fingers flexed slightly, as if clutching at invisible rosary beads, his dirty nails scraping lightly against the rough wood. When he spoke, his voice came soft and trembling, no longer the rasping sermon of a prophet, but the quiet confession of a broken man. I was 9 years old when he came. Holmes watched him closely, his gray eyes sharp in the flickering lamplight. "Who came?" Gideon's eyes lifted slowly to meet Holmes's, wide and glassy with tears that pooled in their hollow rims before sliding down his gaunt cheeks. His lips curled into a faint, haunted smile. "Jack, the Ripper." I was sleeping beneath the workhouse stairs that night, hiding from my father's belt, when I heard the screams from Whitechapel Road. Later I saw the blood in the street. I saw how the men spoke his name with fear, with awe, and I thought, here is a man who is never beaten, never hungry, never cast aside. Here is a man they will never ignore. His smile widened, though tears fell steadily from his eyes, dripping onto his trembling hands. I wanted that. I wanted to be remembered, to be more than dirt in their streets, more than a filthy, worthless orphan with nothing to my name but bruises and scars. Jack showed me that death is power, that blood is truth, that fear is worship. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in the corner, his jaw tightening as he spoke. "So you built a church of it. You took children who had nothing and gave them nothing but your madness." Gideon turned his hollow gaze to Lestrade, blinking slowly as tears continued to spill from his eyes. "I gave them purpose, Inspector. I gave them something greater than hunger. I gave them a father who would never abandon them." His thin shoulders shook with silent laughter, though his eyes burned with fevered devotion. They were already lost. I simply showed them the way, his way. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet and steady, cutting through the trembling darkness of Gideon's words like a thin scalpel through flesh. "But you are not him, Gideon. You are not Jack. You are a frightened child still hiding beneath those stairs. You have spent your life worshiping a darkness that cared nothing for you." Gideon sobbed once, a broken sound torn from deep within his chest. His head dropped forward, his unwashed hair falling across his bruised forehead as tears dripped onto the table's scarred wood. "He cared," he whispered hoarsely, his voice shaking with each syllable. "He showed me truth. He showed me what I was meant to be." Holmes remained silent, watching the trembling figure before him. The gas lamp above flickered again, casting long shadows across the narrow room. Shadows that trembled with each ragged breath Gideon drew. Shadows that flickered like silent spirits across the scratched oak table and the stone walls lined with faint graffiti carved by desperate men over decades of forgotten confessions. Finally, Holmes spoke once more, his voice soft but edged with unbreakable certainty. "What you were meant to be is gone, Gideon, and what remains now is only darkness." Gideon did not respond. His thin shoulders slumped forward, his head bowed in silent, trembling prayer. Tears continued to spill from his eyes, falling onto shackled hands that clenched and unclenched in quiet rhythm, as if still clutching at the phantom warmth of a father who never came to save him. Holmes rose without another word, gathering the papers from the table in a single swift motion. He turned and walked from the chamber, his coat brushing softly against the stone as he passed Lestrade standing silent in the doorway, and behind them, in the flickering lamplight of that narrow room, the prophet of Jack the Ripper wept, not for his sins, nor his victims, nor the children he had broken, but for a shadow that had promised him love, and left only darkness in its place. The following days dawned cold and colorless over London. Gray fog drifted low across the Thames each morning, carrying the faint bite of coal smoke and sewage out to the docks, where ships lay silent beneath creaking masts, and seagulls wheeled through the gloom, crying into empty alleys. Word of the arrests spread quickly through Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Newspaper sellers hawked headlines along Commercial Street and Dorset Street, their calls cutting through the morning stillness like thin blades. Ripper cult discovered beneath Brick Lane children. Freed from murder ritual, Father Gideon, the prophet of death, captured by Scotland Yard. At Baker Street, Holmes spent those days in quiet study, pacing before the tall windows as rain streaked thin, trembling lines down the glass. The parlor was silent but for the ticking of the mantel clock and the scratch of his pen as he updated his case journals, recording each detail with precise clarity. He paused often, staring at the folded orphan drawings laid upon his writing table, each sketch depicting children with blades and the tall, stick-thin figure they worshipped as teacher, protector, and God. Lestrade visited each evening, his face lined with exhaustion from the unending work at Scotland Yard. Raids continued across Whitechapel and Mile End. Officers broke down the doors of abandoned lodging houses, searched hidden rooms behind gin shops, and dragged crates aside in rotting storehouses along the Thames docks. Everywhere they searched, they found the remnants of Gideon's influence, scraps of chalk messages scrawled upon damp brick walls, melted candle stubs burned down to the wick, small rusted blades hidden within crates lined with straw and old newspaper. One raid uncovered a narrow cellar beneath an abandoned warehouse off Cable Street. Within it stood a makeshift altar similar to the one beneath Brick Lane, though smaller, lined with rotting flowers and cracked clay bowls filled with dark, clotted remnants that had dried to iron-red crusts. Nailed to the far wall was a plank of old wood carved with trembling letters. "The children will cleanse the earth." Lestrade reported each discovery to Holmes with quiet bitterness burning behind his tired eyes. The cult's reach, though limited to a small circle, had planned further murders, not merely the poor women of Whitechapel, but prominent businessmen, social reformers, and the wives of city officials. A list was recovered from Gideon's hidden pocket, written upon a torn scrap of hymn book paper. 27 names in total, each marked with a single small cross beside it. "They planned to make them sacrifices," Lestrade said hoarsely, his voice trembling with disgust as he sat in Holmes's armchair, staring down at his clasped hands. To show London that Jack had returned, to show them that their darkness was stronger than their laws. Holmes stood near the window, the lamplight outlining his sharp silhouette against the dim evening fog drifting past Baker Street. He said nothing. His gaze remained distant, fixed upon something unseen beyond the glass, something far older than Gideon's delusions, older than Jack's blade, older than fear itself, the darkness within men that craved power through the worship of suffering. Lestrade rubbed his face roughly with both hands, his voice muffled as he spoke again. "The children? They will live, Holmes. They are under care now at St. Bartholomew's. Doctors, nurses, inspectors, everyone wants to help. But," he lowered his hands, staring at Holmes with eyes filled with quiet grief, "but what if that darkness remains within them? What if they remember him?" Holmes turned slowly, his gray eyes sharp and clear in the trembling lamplight. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke softly, each word resonant with the quiet weight of truth. "They will remember him. They will remember what he made them do. But they will also remember who freed them from it." Lestrade swallowed hard, feeling the tightness burn in his chest. Holmes walked to his writing table and lifted the folded drawing left behind by the smallest boy. He opened it carefully, studying its trembling pencil lines, a tall, thin figure standing between two dark shapes. Beneath it, in the broken handwriting of a child, were three simple words: "He saved us." Holmes folded it again with quiet precision and placed it within his violin case among its lined compartments. He closed the lid gently, the brass latch clicking shut with a finality that echoed softly in the silent parlor. Then he turned back to Lestrade, his face calm, his eyes darkened with a quiet, unbreakable certainty. "We do what we can, Lestrade, for them, for this city, for ourselves. But we must always remember, darkness does not vanish because we close our eyes to it. It only grows deeper." Lestrade nodded silently. Neither man spoke again as the clock upon the mantel ticked onwards into the deepening night, its thin brass hands marking the quiet passing of time against the rising wind outside. And in the silent streets of Whitechapel, lanterns flickered in the gathering dusk, casting long, trembling shadows across soot-blackened brick and broken windows. Shadows that whispered of blood and knives and children's tears, but also of two men who refused to let darkness walk unchallenged through London's silent, watching heart. That evening, after Lestrade departed into the fog-bound streets and the gas lamps burned low along Baker Street, I returned home. I found Holmes seated in his armchair by the fireplace, the violin resting silent across his knees. The lamplight flickered against his sharp features, illuminating the quiet exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes. The case files lay scattered across the table before him. Sketches of crime scenes, anatomical drawings of wounds, charcoal impressions of children's footprints pressed into damp cellar mud. I placed my hat upon its hook and removed my coat slowly, sensing at once the heaviness that lingered in the room. Holmes did not look up. His gaze remained locked upon the violin strings as his long fingers traced them lightly, though no music rose to fill the silent parlor. I stepped forward and stood before the table, scanning the papers laid out in their silent ranks. My gaze paused upon the folded drawing resting atop Holmes's journal, a child's trembling pencil lines depicting a tall, thin figure standing protectively between two dark shadows. Beneath it, in uneven script, were written three small words: "He saved us." I felt the tightness rise within my chest as I looked back to Holmes. His eyes flicked up to meet mine briefly before lowering once more to the violin in his lap. "They were just children, Holmes," I said quietly, my voice trembling despite my effort to remain calm. "Orphans, lost souls, and that man, that creature. He stole from them what little childhood they had left." Holmes did not respond immediately. He set the violin aside with careful precision, resting it upon the cushioned interior of its open case. Then he rose and walked to the window, placing his hands lightly upon the wooden sill. The pale glow of the gas lamps outside cast long shadows across his face, illuminating the quiet sorrow in his sharp gray eyes. I stood watching him, the fire crackling softly behind me as I spoke again, my voice little more than a whisper. Did we stop at Holmes? Did we end it? Or will there always be another Gideon, another Ripper, waiting in the shadows for their moment to strike? Holmes remained silent for a long time. His gaze traveled down to the street below, where the drifting fog coiled around the lampposts and iron railings like silent watching serpents. The faint clatter of carriage wheels echoed along Baker Street, mingling with the distant bark of a lonely dog calling into the gathering night. Finally he spoke, his voice low and calm, though behind it lay a quiet grief that pulsed through each measured syllable. Evil does not die, Watson. It merely changes its name, its face, its devotion. Jack taught London fear. Gideon taught them worship. And somewhere beyond these silent streets, another man watches, another child learns, another blade waits to be sharpened. He turned from the window then, his coat catching the lantern glow, as he walked back to the writing table. His long fingers gathered the papers into a neat stack, aligning their edges with precise, silent care. Then he looked up at me once more, and for the briefest moment I saw in his gray eyes not the cold brilliance of deduction, but the quiet sorrow of a man who saw the darkness within men more clearly than any priest or philosopher ever could. I sat at my desk that night and wrote in my journal until the oil lamp burned low, the nib of my pen scratching softly against the page as dawn's first pale light began to slip through the curtains. And as I recorded each detail, each cellar candle, each child's knife, each trembling confession spoken in a preacher's broken voice, I felt that same heavy truth settle into my bones. Holmes defeated a darkness that fed upon legend, but I fear the name of Jack will always haunt these streets, for darkness does not die with its prophets. It merely waits, silent and unseen, for another desperate soul to kneel before it and call it salvation. The following morning, London awoke under a low, heavy sky the color of damp slate. Thin rain fell steadily over Baker Street, drumming softly against the window panes and washing soot from chimney bricks in long black streaks. The usual morning clatter of carriages and vendors was muted by the persistent drizzle, leaving only the hollow echo of horse hooves striking slick cobblestones to drift up through the cold gray air. I found Holmes seated at the window, his tall frame angled slightly forward, elbows resting upon the sill as he gazed down into the quiet rain-slicked street below. His dark dressing gown draped in silent folds around his shoulders, the collar turned up against the morning chill. Beside him, his pipe sat cold and unlit upon its porcelain tray, untouched since the previous evening. I watched him for several moments before speaking. The room was silent but for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant murmur of rain falling upon the iron railings lining Baker Street. "You did all that could be done, Holmes," I said softly, my voice carrying across the quiet parlor with careful gentleness. "Those children are safe now. Gideon will never hurt them again. His cult is ended." Holmes did not turn. His pale eyes remained locked upon the thin stream of rainwater weaving its way down the window glass, tracing small, winding paths that split and rejoined in silent rivulets before dripping to the ledge below. For a long time, he said nothing. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the quiet pulse of rain upon the roof tiles overhead. Finally he spoke, his voice low and distant, though each syllable carried with it a quiet certainty that resonated through the dim room. "Evil breeds where myth becomes worship, Watson. Jack's blade carved more than flesh. It carved fear into the marrow of this city. Fear that men like Gideon twist into faith, and faith. Faith is far more difficult to kill than any man with a knife. He fell silent again, his gaze unfocused now, as if searching beyond the drifting fog outside, seeing not the milk carts rattling down Baker Street, nor the thin chimney smoke curling skyward from soot-stained brick. Instead, I knew he saw narrow cellars lit by guttering candles, children's small hands clutching rusted blades, shadows kneeling before broken men who promised them love through blood. I stepped forward and placed a hand lightly upon his shoulder. The fabric of his dressing gown was cool and slightly damp from where it pressed against the condensation of the window glass. For a brief moment, I felt the silent tremor that moved through him, not fear nor grief, but a deep, quiet sorrow carried within his bones like a winter chill that no fire could ever fully chase away. "We will remain vigilant, Holmes," I said gently, "and when darkness returns, as it always does, we will be here to meet it." His gaze flicked to me then, pale eyes sharp despite the shadows beneath. A faint, fleeting smile touched the corners of his lips, so brief it might have been imagined, before his expression settled once more into quiet contemplation. He turned back to the window, exhaling softly as the thin rain continued to fall beyond the glass, veiling Baker Street in its silent gray curtain. And in that small, flickering lamplight room, I realized that for Holmes, victory was never triumph. It was only a brief respite, a silent moment between storms. Outside, the gas lamps burned dim in the dawn mist. Water pooled in cracked paving stones, reflecting the trembling glow of lanterns as London stirred to life beneath its endless, watching sky. And within the silent rooms of Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes sat unmoving, pipe unlit, eyes fixed upon a city that slept, never knowing how closely its darkness walked beside its dreams. Later that afternoon, as the rain eased into a thin, persistent mist drifting along the rooftops, Holmes remained seated at his writing table. The gas lamp burned low beside him, its thin flame casting a warm glow across scattered case notes, autopsy sketches, and Scotland Yard reports arranged in silent order. The ticking of the mantel clock marked each passing second with quiet precision, filling the room with a rhythm that seemed to match the slow, measured cadence of Holmes's thoughts. I sat across from him, recording the final pages of my notes on the Ripper cult investigation. Outside, Baker Street lay hushed under the damp gray veil of late afternoon, the faint clop of horses and the occasional rattling carriage drifting through the fog in muffled echoes. Holmes remained silent as he worked, his long fingers sorting each document into neat stacks, aligning their edges with careful precision. Finally, his movements paused. He reached for a thin folded paper tucked between two crime scene sketches and drew it out slowly, holding it lightly between thumb and forefinger. I looked up from my writing and recognized it at once, the drawing left behind by the smallest boy rescued from Gideon's underground altar. Holmes unfolded it carefully, flattening its creased edges upon the table. For a long moment he simply gazed down at its trembling pencil lines. The drawing was simple, childlike. It showed a tall, thin figure standing between two dark shapes. His arms were outstretched, one hand resting upon each shadow beside him. Above his head, thin lines radiated outward, drawn with uneven strokes like beams of light or a simple halo. Beneath the figures, in broken, jagged letters, were three words: "He saved us." Holmes remained motionless, his gray eyes locked upon those words as the gas lamp flickered softly against his sharp features. The rain tapped lightly against the window panes, each drop merging with silent rivulets that slid down the glass to pool upon the ledge outside. After a long while, he reached out and folded the paper with careful precision. He rose from his chair and crossed the parlor to his violin case, resting upon the small table near the window. Opening it, he placed the folded drawing within a narrow compartment lined with worn black velvet, nestled beside old rosine cloths and spare bowstrings. He paused for a moment before closing the case. His gaze lingered upon the drawing, and I saw, just for an instant, a faint softening in his eyes, a flicker of something that was neither triumph nor sorrow, but a quiet, fragile hope. He closed the violin case with a soft click and turned back to me. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and low, resonant with a gentle certainty that rarely touched his words. "Perhaps there is hope, Watson, even for children born in darkness, even for this city." I nodded silently, feeling my throat tighten with the quiet weight of his words. Outside, the fog thickened once more, drifting past the lamplight in silent gray veils. Holmes moved back to his chair and sat down, lifting his violin and bow. For the first time in many days, he raised it to his chin and drew the bow slowly across its strings. A low, trembling note rose into the quiet parlor, vibrating through the dim afternoon light like a whispered prayer. It lingered in the air, filling every corner of the silent room with its mournful beauty. And as I listened, I felt a small, quiet certainty settle within me, that while darkness might always walk beside us, there remained within these narrow streets and cellar shadows a fragile, flickering light, a light carried by men who stood in silence before evil, armed only with truth, courage, and the quiet hope that what they saved today might remain saved tomorrow. Holmes closed his eyes, and the music rose softly through Baker Street, merging with the drifting fog beyond the window, carrying with it the silent prayers of children who would sleep that night free from the shadows that had taught them fear. Night fell quietly over London, bringing with it a heavy rolling fog that crept low along Baker Street and coiled around lampposts like silent gray serpents. The gas lamps burned dim within their glass globes, their thin orange flames flickering faintly against the drifting mist. From his armchair near the window, Holmes watched the shadows merge and shift beyond the glass, his violin resting silent upon his knee. The parlor was dim but warm. A low fire crackled in the grate, its red glow casting trembling reflections across polished brass and dark wood paneling. Mrs. Hudson had brought tea earlier in the evening, leaving the tray upon the side table without a word when she saw Holmes seated unmoving, his sharp gray eyes distant and shadowed with thought. I sat across from him, my journal resting upon my lap, though my pen lay idle. The silence between us felt calm now, filled not with tension or dread, but with a quiet, exhausted peace. The case was done. The children were safe. Father Gideon awaited trial within the stone walls of Newgate Prison, watched by constables day and night to ensure he harmed neither himself nor any other. Holmes reached forward slowly and placed his violin back into its lined case, nestling it gently among its worn velvet compartments. His long fingers lingered for a moment upon the folded drawing tucked between the rosine cloth and spare bowstrings. Then he closed the case with a soft, decisive click. I watched him carefully. In that quiet movement, I saw the weariness that settled beneath his pale, angular features. Holmes did not show fatigue as other men did. There were no slumped shoulders nor trembling hands. Instead, a deep, silent gravity lay within his eyes, as if each evil he unraveled carved a quiet shadow into his soul, adding to the tapestry of darkness he carried without complaint. He stood and walked to the window, placing his hand lightly against the cold glass. The fog pressed against it from outside, merging his reflection with the pale, shifting shadows drifting through Baker Street. For a long time, he stood unmoving, his breathing slow and measured, his gaze distant, as though seeing beyond the gaslit streets into something far older and deeper than London itself. Finally he spoke, his voice low and calm, though behind it lay a quiet sadness that tremored softly through each syllable. "Perhaps there is hope, Watson, even for children born in darkness, even for them." I closed my journal and set it aside upon the writing table. Rising, I crossed to stand beside him. The lamplight behind us threw our reflections onto the fog-clouded glass, his tall, thin silhouette outlined beside my broader frame, both blurred into silent shadows by the drifting mist beyond the window. "Hope, Holmes?" I asked softly. "Do you truly believe it remains for them, after all they have seen?" He turned his gaze to me then, his pale eyes sharp and clear despite the exhaustion lining them. For a moment his lips curled into the faintest of smiles, small and fleeting, but real. "Hope remains, Watson, always, even in shadows, for if it did not, then what purpose would any of this serve?" I felt the tightness in my chest ease as I met his calm gaze. Outside, the fog drifted and shifted, revealing fleeting glimpses of quiet lamp-lit streets before swallowing them once more in its silent gray veils. Somewhere far off, the faint toll of midnight bells rolled through London, resonant and low, marking the end of a day that had stolen innocence, but returned it before the final darkness fell. Holmes stepped away from the window, lifting his coat from its hook near the door. As he shrugged it over his shoulders, I saw his eyes flick briefly towards his violin case, resting closed upon the side table. "He saved us." Those three small words remained within that case, tucked alongside old bowstrings and folded rosine cloth, a silent testament to the fragile light still burning within the hearts of children, broken by a madman's worship. Holmes turned to me, his voice quiet and even. "Come, Watson, let us walk. The fog is thick tonight, but London still sleeps safely beneath it." I followed him down the narrow stairs, the warmth of the parlor fading behind us as we stepped out into the cold embrace of the fog-bound street. The lamps flickered dimly in their glass cages, casting trembling orange halos upon wet cobblestones that shone like dark glass beneath our boots. And as we walked side by side through the silent streets, I felt within me the quiet certainty that Holmes spoke truth. For though shadows might gather and darkness might breed devotion in broken hearts, hope remained. It walked beside us in silence, small and flickering, but unextinguished. Fog drifted thick and silent along Whitechapel's narrow lanes that night. It coiled low around iron railings, curled across the cobblestones in shifting gray veils, and pressed against the windows of darkened houses like a silent, watchful intruder. Gas lamps burned within it, their orange glow trembling against the suffocating dark, casting long shadows that wavered and merged until street and shadow became one indistinguishable world. Holmes and I walked along Hanbury Street in silence, our footsteps muffled by the damp grit and moss gathered between stones worn smooth by decades of market carts and nightcabs. The chill of midnight seeped through my wool coat, settling into my shoulders with a quiet, aching weight. I glanced at Holmes as we moved through the fog. His sharp profile was outlined dimly by the flickering lamps, his coat collar turned up high against the cold, his hat brim dripping with fine mist. His eyes remained forward, scanning each shadowed doorway, each darkened window above shuttered shops, each flicker of distant movement half seen through the drifting fog. But his gaze held no tension now, no tightness of pursuit or calculation. Instead, it held a deep, silent gravity, the gaze of a man who understood darkness not as mystery, but as truth. We paused at the corner near Dorset Street, where the last of Gideon's victims had been found. The alley lay empty and silent, littered only with discarded crates and torn scraps of newsprint, dampened by the fog's silent touch. Holmes stood unmoving for a long moment, his gloved hands resting lightly upon the iron railing as he looked down into the silent shadows pooled between the leaning brick walls. Finally he spoke, his voice low and calm, though each word carried the quiet certainty of knowledge laid bare. The streets remember, Watson. Blood seeps into stone, fear breathes into walls. Legends root themselves into the marrow of a place until it knows no other truth. He turned from the railing and continued walking east towards Commercial Street, his boots echoing softly in the damp silence. I fell into step beside him, glancing back once at the dark alley behind us before letting it disappear into the thickening fog. "Do you believe it will end, Holmes?" I asked quietly as we passed under a flickering lamp whose flame struggled against the heavy mist. "This darkness, these men who take legend and twist it into worship?" Holmes's gaze remained forward, his face calm and still in the trembling lamplight. For a long time he did not reply. Then he spoke, his voice resonant and quiet beneath the distant tolling of Whitechapel Church's midnight bell. "No, it will not end. Darkness does not end. It sleeps, it shifts, it changes its name and face, but it remains. There will always be another who kneels before it. Another who believes salvation is found in blood and fear. Jack may be gone, but his shadow remains. It walks these streets still, waiting for a new name to wear." We reached the end of Commercial Street where the fog pressed thicker, veiling even the glow of lamps within its silent depths. The faint clatter of hooves sounded somewhere far off, echoing along brick walls and iron shutters until it faded once more into the waiting quiet. Holmes stopped and turned to me, his gray eyes sharp and clear despite the exhaustion that lined them. "But it is not darkness alone that remains, Watson. So long as men stand against it, so long as even one child remembers what hope feels like, it cannot win." He fell silent then, lifting his collar higher against the chill breeze that stirred the fog around our knees. Together we stood beneath the gas lamp as its trembling flame burned dim within its glass cage. The silence of Whitechapel wrapped around us like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of soot, damp stone, and secrets buried beneath centuries of blood and fear. Somewhere in the silent streets beyond, hidden eyes watched from curtained windows and broken cellar grates. Somewhere in the fog, another desperate soul waited to carve their name into the marrow of London's memory, for the shadow of the Ripper never fully left these streets. And as Holmes and I turned and began our long walk home through the sleeping city, I understood with quiet certainty that though darkness might remain forever, so too would the thin, flickering light, carried by men who refused to let it walk unchallenged. That light walked beside me then, silent and unbreakable, outlined in flickering lamplight and drifting fog. A tall, thin figure moving calmly through London's shadows. Sherlock Holmes. As the fog thickened once more over Baker Street and the silent streets of London drifted into slumber beneath the dim orange glow of distant lamps, I invite you now to rest your thoughts and let your mind grow calm. Allow the quiet footsteps of Holmes and Watson to fade softly into the shadows. Know that for tonight their work is done. Evil has been faced. Innocence has been guarded. And though darkness still whispers at the edges of the world, for now, peace settles gently across the city's silent rooftops. Breathe in slowly and feel the stillness within you. Breathe out and release the weight of all you have carried today. Let your thoughts drift like fog across silent streets, where each lamp glows warm with safety. Each alley remains quiet and undisturbed, and each hidden place is watched over by unseen eyes that bring only comfort and protection. Rest now, knowing that the shadows cannot touch you here. You are safe, you are calm, and all is well for this night. Sleep deeply, dear listener, until we meet again in the quiet stories of tomorrow's dawn.